Chapter 9:32. The plane landed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Russell came back from the bathroom, wearing a nightcap, and sat on the sofa next to Huaishur. He yawned as if he was sleep-deprived. The plane taxied on the runway. The endless yellow of the desert and the silhouette of high-rise buildings could be vaguely seen in the distance. Huaishur was still flipping through the travel brochure, page after page, extremely fast. In the end, he completely skipped it. Casino, casino, and casino. All of them were items that he was not interested in. "What are you doing here?" Huaishur asked. "Are you taking your students to gamble? Isn't it a bit too much to go to the present to spend money?" "Huaishur, Isaac will kill me." Russell shook his head, but suddenly found a new direction and was eager to try. "Why don't you transfer some funds from Dombois? If we win the bet, how about we split it equally?" "Huh?" Huaishur rolled his eyes and was too lazy to pay attention to him. Las Vegas. Russell propped his chin on his hand and stared at the city that was gradually enlarging outside the window. "Logically speaking, I should be explaining to you how this city was built, how it expanded to its current state under the influence of the original sin, how it fell, and how it indulged in a life of debauchery and luxury. But as a teacher, I am really not interested in this. If I have to say it, I can only say that it is so big. It is here with the thing we want to get back." "What thing?" Huaishur asked. "Money." Russell said, "A lot of money. If you don't know how much it is, then I can only say that it is a lot of money." Huaishur sighed. He really didn't want to ask him how much a lot was. If he said a lot, then a lot. However, as the plane taxied, he gradually realized that something was wrong. The travel brochure slowly closed, and his expression became serious. It was the most famous tourist city in the Americas. It had a huge airport and was the most important transportation hub. It was a place where countless planes took off and landed. So, why couldn't Huaishur sense the presence of any other passengers? "Old man, did you offend someone?" "No, this is a show of sincerity, Huaishur." Russell shook the newspaper and took off the glasses on the bridge of his nose. "The host is here to welcome the guests. Remember to be serious. Don't look like you haven't seen the world." Huaishur was amused. "What have I not seen before?" 10 minutes later, Huaishur was dumbfounded when he saw the empty terminal and the two long rows of waiters in suits and leather shoes. "I've never seen such a scene before." At this moment, there was not a single unrelated passenger in the huge airport. All of them had been cleared out. This should have caused a huge uproar, but at this moment, there was no abnormality at all. The planes that had already landed were towed to the runway to wait, while the planes that did not land were circling in the sky again and again. The stranded or passing passengers had been cleared out as early as 3 hours ago when Russell and the others boarded the plane. At this moment, in the huge Las Vegas airport, there were only 2 people waiting for their arrival. "Welcome, Mr. Russell, Mr. Huaishur." The white-haired old man held his cane and took the lead to walk forward. He nodded and saluted. "Your arrival brings light to this humble city." Russell shrugged and looked at Huaishur. "See, I told you. It's their good fortune to be here. Why are you being so polite?" The corner of Huaishur's eyes twitched. It was the first time he had seen such a shameless guy. But the old man seemed to fall for this trick, and his attitude became more and more respectful. "Would you like to stay in a hotel first? We have prepared rooms for you in the Star of the Empire." "I'm a little hungry. Let's eat first." Russell casually threw the luggage into his arms. "No problem." The old man picked up the luggage himself and followed behind him. "The 6 3-star chef demons are ready to satisfy all your appetites at any time." "How considerate." Russell laughed. "I feel like I'm just missing 2 beautiful girls to feed me." The old man's expression didn't change. "If you need it, I'll arrange it immediately. Then arrange for a few beautiful girls to eat for me." Russell nodded, not knowing whether he was joking or serious. "I hope they could be happier." "No problem." The old man asked, "Do you have any requirements for the ladies to eat? Skin color or anything else?" "Any wish can be satisfied." Russell praised. "You're really like Santa Claus." In front of Mr. Russell, how could I dare to take advantage of my seniority? The old man bowed his head. "You are a distinguished guest. This is my duty." "See, Huaishur, This is called professionalism. Russell said happily to the young man behind him, "We'll satisfy all your needs and make you feel at home." Even if you say to him, "Sorry, we plan to burn this city to ashes," he'll tell you, "Sorry, that will have to wait for 2 hours because we don't have enough gasoline." Then do you want to burn it? Fleischer carried his luggage and walked casually behind, ignoring the attentions of the waiter. He had already noticed some kind of strange aura hidden behind this seemingly warm and harmonious atmosphere. He was too lazy to look at everything that dazzled him. Of course not. Why sure? Russell enjoyed this overly enthusiastic service with a clear conscience. His footsteps were brisk. We're not destructive maniacs. Why should we burst such a beautiful soap bubble? He stared at the city in the distance and whistled. It's a miracle that the bubble can exist for so long. It's not beautiful to insist on a reality. It's better to let it remain as it is. Anyway, it has nothing to do with us, right? Outside the airport, the luxury car that had been waiting for them for a long time had already opened its door to them. Champagne and whiskey lying in ice buckets, and even cigars in the storage cabinet were available without limit. After they started, there was no shaking or turbulence. It was as if they were sitting on a soft sofa and waiting for the servants to serve them delicacies. Now, when the partition was raised, there were only 2 people left in the car. Without any scruples about whether there were any bugs listening in, Fleischer said bluntly, "They're afraid of you." Afraid? Russell held his wine glass and shook his head indifferently. "They're not afraid of me. Fleischer. I'm an old man who has long passed my own version. What's there to be afraid of? They're just afraid of embarrassment. They're afraid that I'll make some unreasonable requests. They're afraid that everyone will be unhappy and hinder their business and prevent them from making money." Russell sighed in confusion. "But they're not afraid of me. Isn't that strange?" Fleischer subconsciously felt his hair stand on end. "Hey, you're not really going to cause trouble, are you?" Fleischer felt uneasy. This is the Discovery realm. The consequences of a fifth-rank fight are very serious. Moreover, he was a special military officer of the Astronomy Association. Although he was the weakest special military officer in history, he was still a special military officer. What if the command bureau sent a telegram asking him to cut off Russell's head? Should he do it or wait a while? Wasn't this a dilemma? "Don't worry. No one will cause trouble. Why sure? There won't be any war here today." Russell's fingertips held up the wine glass filled with ice and laughed mockingly. "The other party won't give us any excuse to start a war. No matter how rude we are, they won't get angry. Even if we hit them on the left side of their face, they'll stick out their right side. Although I won't do that." "Then what are you going to do?" Fleischer asked straightforwardly. "Even if you want to fight or kill, at least give me a warning, right? It'll be convenient for me to act according to your mood, right?" "Let me think." Russell pondered for a moment and said seriously, "Probably to collect debts." "Collect debts?" "Yes, to collect debts, and recover assets. That's about it." Russell glanced at the bustling city outside the window and sighed softly. 70 years ago, the utopia was in chaos. After the fall of Heavenly State, the various departments also fell apart. In the end, even their own existence was canceled from the Astronomy Association. Now that I think about it, that period of time was really chaotic and turbulent. I don't even know how I survived. Every day, I thought about how to survive until the next day and how to deal with the difficult situation. When I came back to my senses, everything was over. When I looked back, other than a few old friends around me, there was only devastation left. At that time, this desert was still a godforsaken place. This place didn't exist, he said slowly. After the collapse of the utopia and the chaos, everyone couldn't even take care of themselves. Therefore, some people came up with the idea of embezzling. Embezzling? Fleischer was stunned. That's right. In the early years, there was a batch of strategic reserves of the utopia here. Although it can't be compared to our sunken old campus, it's actually a very important material reserve point. Then, after some of the keepers heard about the collapse of the utopia, they decided to make more effective use of this wealth. Russell smiled mockingly. So, after a few procedures, the Utopia's strategic reserves appeared openly in the black market. After obtaining a large amount of wealth, they didn't stop. Instead, they began to invest and build. In the end, there was this city of desire in front of you, why sure. Now, of the 16 people back then, 6 have died, for have lost everything, and the remaining 6 have become the final victors. After so many years, they bid farewell to their unbearable past, built great achievements, and became miracles. They even controlled an entire independent city, joined the American City Alliance, and became a glorious part of it. He turned around and asked softly, "If it were you, how could you be in a good mood when the people of the Utopia reappeared in front of you? But after so many years, didn't anyone care?" Huaisher asked, "Didn't you care either? How could a school far away at the border intervene in the current situation?" Huaisher. Russell shook his head. "Don't be too harsh on your teachers, okay? You have to learn to be more tolerant." To Russell at that time, saving the ivory tower from the turmoil and a school from the waves that swept across the entire territory was already a miracle after sacrificing everything. Perhaps he still had the strength to do more, but in the face of the cold reality, he was already disheartened and unwilling to pay attention to it. In the blink of an eye, so many years had passed. If nothing had happened, he might have remained like this until he died of old age. Speaking of which, you're the one who let me see a turning point in the reconstruction of celestial genealogy. Russell turned around and looked at the student beside him, making Huaisher feel a little embarrassed. It's just bringing back the Book of Destiny, and it can't be dismantled. It's not a big deal, right? What's important is the Book of Destiny, Huaisher. Luo Su smiled and didn't say anything else. He just could not help but recall. When Huaisher stood in front of him, when the traces of the Book of Destiny appeared in front of him again, how should he describe his feelings at that moment? Joy, fear, jealousy, killing intent, or shame? It was indescribable. When this young man carried a burden that did not belong to him and walked toward him in pursuit of the remnants of the Utopia, Russell actually felt a fear that he had never felt before. He had not been defeated by the cruel fate, nor had he been obliterated by the cold world. The smile that was riddled with scars but filled with love and joy for everything was like a mirror. It reflected a completely unrecognizable version of himself. The version of himself who was gradually drowning in the anesthesia of his unrestrained self. At that moment, he understood that perhaps this was a reason why the Book of Destiny did not choose him. The moment he gave up resisting fate, he had already abandoned this fate. However, it did not matter. He no longer cared. He did not have any hatred for this at all. Instead, he was filled with indescribable gratitude. The funny thing was that he had wanted to obtain the approval of the Book of Destiny all his life, but after giving up this dream, he finally understood himself. You will definitely become someone who far surpasses me. Why sure? He firmly believed in this and solemnly promised the student beside him, "Don't worry. This is my duty as a teacher." Huaisher was stunned and suddenly felt a little uneasy when he was looked at with such expectant eyes. He smelled the scent of an arrangement. "Why are you suddenly saying this?" he asked warily. "It's nothing. Don't be afraid." Russell suddenly smiled crookedly, raised his finger, and gestured an insignificant distance. "I just want to increase the difficulty for you a little. The new generation surpasses the old." Perhaps it was an unchanging principle since ancient times for students to surpass their teachers. However, no one said that only the new generation could chase after the new generation while the new generation had to stay put, right? Imagining his future students climbing the steep cliff tiredly with no end in sight, he became more and more delighted. "Let's go, we're here." When a moving vehicle slowly stopped, Russell stood up, patted him on the shoulder, and told him meaningfully, "Get ready." He said, "It'll be your turn soon." Chapter 9:33. 3 hours ago, in the center of Las Vegas, on the top floor of the Star of the Empire, the largest and most glorious casino hotel in the city. After the elevator opened, a young man with a solemn expression hurried through the corridor and pushed the door open. Behind the door, at the highest point in the city, it was silent. Only the monotonous ticking of the life support equipment echoed in the air. Behind the huge floor-to-ceiling window, the bustling city could be seen clearly. It was as if the blood in the pulse was flowing right in front of him. However, behind the curtain, on the propped-up hospital bed, between countless cables, there was only a dying old man. The young man subconsciously slowed down and paused for a moment. He tidied up his collar and walked forward. He lowered his head and said, "Father, I'm back." The old man stared out of the window in a daze and suddenly asked, "William, where is he?" 2 hours ago, Russell and the others got on the plane and flew straight to Las Vegas. William lowered his head and calmly reported, "According to your instructions, we've gathered the managers of the 6 families and made preparations." The old man nodded and looked to the side. The doctor who accompanied the old man nodded, opened the box beside him, and lifted the old man's right hand. As the medicine was injected, a sickly color appeared on the old man's face. He panted violently and coughed. "Father," William took a step forward excitedly, but then he stopped and lowered his head in grief and indignation. "Why are you panicking? I just used some medicine." The old man laughed hoarsely and stared at his face. "You're already 25 years old this year, William. Thinking about it, it's really fast. As the only son of the family, it must be hard, right?" William lowered his head and did not answer. "It's not easy to bear this heavy burden. Carry it well." The old man waved his hand. "I have a gift for you." He gestured for his son to open the box in front of the bed. Inside the box was a ferocious iron light, a revolver covered in scratches, and 6 bullets. The weathered weapon was meticulously cared for. Even after so many years, it was still in its best condition. Every part and every screw was flawless. It was just like the mass-produced guns sold in gun shops everywhere in the city. It wasn't a precious or famous item, but everyone in the city should know whose gun it was. It had accompanied its master for 79 years, following him from a nobody to the overlord of this city. After witnessing so many storms and countless deaths, its master no longer needed it to display its authority, but everyone was more and more in awe of it. "Take it," the old man said, "it's yours." William stood rooted to the ground, not daring to extend his hand. After hesitating for a long time, he finally took it out of the box. But right after that, his wrist was gripped so tightly that it was like an iron clamp, almost crushing his bones, not allowing him to struggle at all. "Take it with you when we meet later." The old man raised his eyes and stared at his son who was right in front of him. His turbid eyes seemed to be flowing with hot lava, as if he wanted to burn his enemy's soul to ashes. He ordered with a pause between each word. "Remember, William, I will only say these words once," the old man whispered hoarsely. "If I don't give you permission, you can't speak. If anyone else speaks before me, you will use my gun to kill them. If anyone offends my guest, you will use it to kill his wife, parents, brothers, and children. Not even a dog can be left behind, even if the person speaking is your uncle's. Do you understand?" "Father, why?" William shook his head blankly, unable to understand. "Really, is it really necessary to do this? He is only one person. As long as you are willing, we can make him pay any price. We can even ask the heavens." "Idiot!" the old man roared, his hoarse voice like thunder. "Is it your turn to call the shots in my city?" It was as if he wanted to brutally tear his eardrums and question his soul. William no longer had the courage to argue or refute. He lowered his head in horror. "Very good. That's it, William." The old man coughed violently, but his expression became gratified. "Dismiss all the people you arranged. Keep your head down and look at your feet. Don't look at his eyes, and don't hide your fear. You are a good child, William, but you are too young. You have to listen to me." He slowly let go of his hand, unable to hide his old age and powerlessness. He leaned on the bed. After a long time, William asked helplessly, "Father, do you think we have no chance of winning at all?" "Idiot, what's the use of victory?" The old man was amused. "If you want to win, can you pay a sufficient price? You want to be the enemy of the world's craziest idealist, an opponent who is not afraid of physical destruction, who is not afraid of sacrifice, who does not care about the tragic consequences. Have you thought about the consequences? In the long silence, William fell into silence. He had nothing to say. Don't worry, Russell will retreat in the face of difficulties, William. The old man whispered hoarsely, one day, you will get everything you deserve. That pair of turbid eyes quietly looked down at the city outside the window. It was like a dying beast staring at its own country. Before that, I won't let anyone take it away. When he got out of the car, Huaisher's body suddenly tensed up for a moment. He frowned, because in front of him was not the bright lights of Las Vegas, but a military base with layers of barbed wire and machine guns. For a moment, Huaisher thought that the other party was playing some trick of accidentally entering the White Tiger Festival Hall. But he immediately reacted. With Russell, this old bastard, there was no old fox who dared to show off his sleight skill in front of an expert. Moreover, no matter how much he was underestimated, he was still a special military officer of the Astronomy Association. Not to mention the White Tiger Festival Hall. Even if he rushed into the central decision-making room of the Central Bureau and jumped 300 times, as long as he didn't die, he would definitely be in the most comprehensive, serious, and unruffled internal court. As long as there was even the slightest bit of trickery, there would be 800 inspectors on the overhead floor with magnifying glasses to rummage through it to death. Why would he need to worry about this? He shook his head with a smile and looked around. In front of the open door, he saw a few people who were already so old that it was shocking. Their white hair was sparse, and their bodies were thin. Some were holding canes, some were supported by others, and some were sitting in wheelchairs with oxygen masks. It was as if they had been waiting for a long time, but there was no impatience at all. When Huaisher and Russell got out of the car, they took the initiative to welcome them, accompanied by their children and medical staff. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Russell," the old man in the wheelchair said in a hoarse voice. "I greet you on behalf of the Las Vegas Business Alliance. How should I address you?" Russell lowered his head and asked, "Douglas." The old man suppressed the urge to cough and said, "Just call me Douglas." "Okay, Douglas." Russell nodded, looked past the wheelchair in front of him, and looked around. "Does Las Vegas use a military base to receive guests? If you're here as a guest, we'll definitely welcome you with open arms. All of Las Vegas will be your friends, and you'll be treated with the utmost respect wherever you go. If anyone dares to offend you, they'll become everyone's enemy. I can guarantee that." Douglas panted and asked hoarsely, "But you didn't come for this, did you? I believe that being open and honest is a good thing for both of us." Russell raised his eyebrows slightly. He didn't expect the other party to be so frank. But soon, he was puzzled again. If you want to be enemies, just relying on this base in front of you isn't enough, right? He said, "With your wealth, you should be able to hire at least 4 or 5 fifth-order soldiers. You might even be able to buy Tyr, your natural enemy, to fight for you." "Haha, you must be joking. For someone like you, these people in front of you are nothing." Douglas laughed self-deprecatingly. "Please rest assured, no matter what, we will not be disrespectful or rude to you today." He patted the armrest of the wheelchair and signaled the attendant behind him to turn around and walk to the front. "Please follow me." In front of him, the gates of the military base were open layer by layer. Countless defenses were withdrawn from the center, and the gate was wide open. After walking in, Huaisher realized that this was not an ordinary base at all. On both sides of the long runway, in the open hangars, there were rows of fighter jets being repaired. Across the bustling military training ground, he could also see the missile launch site in the distance, and they were going deep underground. Riding in a vehicle, they passed through a deep tunnel. After traveling down for an unknown amount of time, a huge door appeared under the fortifications that could withstand a nuclear attack. In front of the metal door, Douglas panted weakly in his wheelchair and raised his finger. Very quickly, a subordinate walked forward and entered the password, verifying the iris, fingerprint, and origin substance. Once the 3 layers of encryption were removed, the door opened with a bang. Countless cold spotlights shone down from the ceiling, causing the resplendent golden light to sweep out like a flood. Huaisher's eyes were stung by the dazzling golden light. and he couldn't help but squint his eyes. He sucked in a breath of cold air. A sea of gold. This was a sea of gold, through and through. Countless trapezoidal gold bars were piled up into small mountains, towering in the underground warehouse, reflecting a brilliant light that made one's soul tremble. There were no cumbersome diamonds, nor were there any lie-like bonds. What was gathered here was the currency that humans had used since ancient times. This was a terrifying amount of wealth that could be compared to national reserves. Chapter 9:34. No matter who it was, when money appeared in front of their eyes on such a terrifying scale, it was inevitable that they would be stunned for a moment, as well as an instinctive impulse. In the silence, Huaishir's face was as calm as water, and there was no expression on his face. He was not moved at all, but secretly, he could not help but think quickly. He had already begun to calculate how to break through the defense and security on the ground, how many people and what kind of tools would be needed to successfully take away such an unjust amount of dung, how to plan, how to gather people, how to find the weakness of the defense, how to enter and exit under the nose of the American army, and finally how to launder and divide the loot. By the time he pulled back his thoughts from the slippery slope, he had already missed the opportunity to express himself. Instead, it was Russell who whistled. He did not hide his admiration at all, and he sighed with emotion from the bottom of his heart. Is this the financial power of Las Vegas? It's really spectacular. By the way, how much is this? He turned around and asked. A total of 1,300 tons of gold, 210 tons of source crystals, and 400 tons of pure gold. In addition, there's also a key to the vault of the Bank of America here. All the relics of the border that flowed out of the black market back then are here. On the wheelchair, Douglas reached out and took a box from his subordinate's hand. He presented it with both hands. I know why you're here, Mr. Russell. We have no intention of arguing about what happened back then, but we're willing to pay the price for it. He said, we'll pay you back double. Just like that, he lowered his head, raised his hands high, and respectfully presented the assets and price that he had taken away back then. As long as you're willing to nod your head at this moment here, everything will belong to you. And Las Vegas will be your friend forever. In any dispute, if you appear on the opposite side, we'll retreat and never be your enemy. Russell smiled. He lowered his head, looked at the box, and flicked the ash off his cigarette. But he did not take it. How interesting, Douglas. Whether it's you or this world, you always surprise me. He sighed softly. It's been 70 years. 70 years ago, I didn't even know your name. 70 years later, you're already standing in front of me, negotiating with me. The world had changed so quickly. So many years had passed, and the Americas had changed from the wilderness to the 5 pillars of reality. The Republic had been born and fallen, and Las Vegas had changed from a deserted desert to a city of desire. Technology was advancing, the times were developing, and the currency was expanding. Every day was different from yesterday, and tomorrow would be different from today. Everything is improving and growing, and so are you. But it's like we're still stuck in the past, immersed in the afterglow of the past, unable to face the painful future. In the dead silence, no one responded. Only the old man's laughter became more mocking. 70 years ago, you seized the resources stored in the utopia and plundered the wealth we had accumulated. Using this as a foundation, you won a huge family business and assets. Now that 70 years have passed, and I'm here, you're telling me, don't be angry. We didn't do it on purpose. We intend to repay the principal. In order to prevent you from complaining, we can even double the price. It's as if I'm a beggar who came knocking on your door. He lowered his head in disbelief and asked, just how low have I fallen for you to embarrass me like this? In the long silence, no one responded. Only Douglas' heavy breathing under the oxygen mask could be heard. After a long time, the old man in the wheelchair replied in a hoarse voice, We're showing our sincerity, Mr. Russell. No one here dares to humiliate you. No, that's actually what you're doing, isn't it? Russell shook his head and sneered. It's just that the way you humiliate me makes people think that you're very polite. In fact, that's not the case, is it? Douglas, you have to understand that I'm not here for your friendship or your sincerity. He enunciated each word clearly. I just want to take back what's rightfully ours. You can name your price. Douglas raised his eyes. His weak eyes seemed to be burning with flames. This is also the reason why I'm here today. No matter what kind of compensation you want, we can talk about it. Russell chuckled softly. In other words, you're ready to negotiate? We'll do our best to put an end to disputes and break the peace, Mr. Russell. Douglas didn't back down. He replied calmly. The difference is whether you're willing to negotiate or not. Of course, why wouldn't I be willing? It's a peaceful era now. Would I go on a killing spree because of my personal feelings? Russell grinned and mocked. Douglas, if you want to negotiate, then I can negotiate for you. It's just that the person you want to negotiate with is not me. He paused for a moment and looked behind him. Not far away, Huaishur, who was leaning against the door and taking a selfie with his back facing the mountain of gold, stiffened. He couldn't help but tremble. He couldn't believe it. What the hell? He was shocked and lost his voice. The people of Dongxia say that when the master has something to do, the disciple has to do it, right? Russell happily blew the smoke from his cigar. How about you replace me? Huaishur felt his head swelling rapidly. It was like a balloon. His head hurt. So this is what you're talking about. Why did you arrange for me to do it for no reason? Don't look so resistant, Huaishur. Isn't this what you should do as an assistant and secretary? Now that I think about it, you haven't done it even once. It's really a little dereliction of duty. Russell proposed excitedly. Since we happen to meet this time, I'll leave it to you. As if he had finally remembered his duty as a teacher, Russell looked as if he didn't mind the trouble, egging him on like a devil. It just so happens that I, as a teacher, can use some martial arts. Let's treat it as a social practice class. How about it? It's so troublesome to argue with both sides. Huaishur shook his head decisively. If he had the time, he might as well do a talent show. Forget it. I'm not good at this kind of superficial work. That's the work for the subordinates. They don't have the responsibility and ability to bear the consequences, so they can only do it piecemeal and haggle over every penny to deduct a few cents of profit. It's like buying cabbage and cutting the price. Russell shook his head and said seriously, but what I'm going to teach you is not this, and it won't be so troublesome. It will be more direct and preserve the dignity of both sides. At the same time, it will be more straightforward. As a leader, how to express your attitude correctly is part of your duty. You should start learning, Huaishur. As he said that, he spread his hands and suggested, let's start now, how about it? In the silence, the corner of Huaishur's eyes twitched for a long time. He sighed helplessly. Everything had been arranged. What else could he do? Huaishur nodded slightly. In a moment of trance, he realized that he was in the middle of a golden mountain, surrounded by countless gold. Even the long table and chair in front of him were made of metal that could redeem souls. In a magnificent and solemn treasury, both sides of the long table were divided into two sides. Huaishur sat at the front, feeling a little strange as he adapted to the feeling of being in the limelight. On the golden recliner behind him, Russell raised his hand, crushed the cigar in his hand, and began to talk about the first key point of today's lesson. First of all, before the negotiation begins, you need to explain to the other party the purpose of your visit. He asked the student in front of him as if he was teaching a child how to solve a problem step by step. Huaishur, what is our purpose? Recover assets? Huaishur was a little uncertain. It's too general. You need to set a scope and goal, and you need to draw a bottom line for yourself. Russell reminded him, what can you fight for, and what can you give up? Only when you understand these can you not be led by the nose by the other party. How do I set this? Huaishur was confused. Russell waved his hand indifferently, not caring at all. Think about it yourself. You have a try. Return it 10 times. Ha ha. Russell laughed. You're really easy to deal with, Huaishur. The price is too low. If we do this, we will definitely be regarded as country bumpkins. Huaishur thought for a moment and asked seriously, what if our purpose is to take everything away? You could try. Russell held his chin, full of expectation. Maybe it will work. On the opposite side of the long table, Douglas was expressionless, but behind him, The representatives of the Casino Alliance were already livid. How could they still not understand? Russell didn't care about the result of the negotiation at all. This old thing, treating this place as a kindergarten, treating power as a toy, putting it in the hands of a child, and admiring the way he wielded power. He was just here to bring the students to class. And they were the cheap models hanging on Russell's blackboard, the flasks and measuring cups in chemistry class, and the teaching tools used to explain theorems. Enough! Someone roared gloomily. Mr. Russell, don't you have any sincerity at all? No one responded. Only Douglas glanced to the side indifferently. William nodded, reached into his pocket, held the pistol, and pulled it out. But his movements came to an abrupt halt. It was as if he had suddenly pressed the pause button. He was stiff in place. He couldn't move. Only a pair of eyes were full of confusion. Oh, an unexpected incident. Why, sure, someone is here to mess things up. Russell sighed. In fact, unexpected situations often occur in negotiations. For example, the other party can't suppress internal differences, causing someone to deliberately create an accident with the intention of affecting the process and result of the negotiation. He paused like a teacher asking a question and asked Huaishur, "If it were you, what would you do?" "It's me?" Huaishur asked. "Yes, it's you. You're the one in charge now." Huaishur. "Don't care about my opinion. Whether it succeeds or fails, it's just a practical assessment, and it's the kind of learning and applying." Russell said patiently, "You can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter." Huaishur thought for a moment and shrugged. "To be honest, I don't like idiots who pretend to be stupid and muddy the waters." He said, "I'll chop off his head." Too violent, Huaishur. Lacking grace and bearing. 1 point deducted. Russell shook his head. He was a little helpless about this student's habitual violent style. "But since you said so, then I'll chop off his head." He raised his finger and tapped on the gold of the armrest. He issued a mock judgment of death penalty. In an instant, the sluggish objector was frozen in place. There was nothing above his neck. But he didn't die. He didn't even shed a drop of blood. It was as if something terrible had taken it and hidden it. He raised his hand blankly and touched the empty space above his neck. He seemed to be screaming in horror, but he couldn't hear a sound and didn't understand what had happened. He ran aimlessly in fear. In the end, he was dragged down by someone who reacted. Only now did William finally regain consciousness. But he looked at the old man at the end of the long table and didn't have the courage to take out his weapon. Douglas's eyes were downcast, as if he didn't care. "Then, after announcing the purpose of your visit, we can enter the second stage." Russell spread his hands and received it happily. "Now, you can show your strength and capital, Huaishur." Chapter 9:35. It was like being in a classroom in the ivory tower. Under the afternoon sun, the old man on the sofa smoked a cigar and taught his students the wisdom of life and the essence of human nature, teaching them etiquette, how to visit your enemy in a proper and serious manner. There is no need for complicated afternoon tea rules, no need for cumbersome conversation skills, and no need to haggle and haggle. Instead, it was how to take back what they had won in a proper way. First of all, they had to express their intentions openly and honestly. There was no need to hide and let the other party know why they were here. Then, they had to show their strength and capital to win the respect of others. Strength and capital? Huaishur began to want to laugh. He had a lot of titles, but he didn't know which one was suitable at this time. Prince of Paradise? A has-been idol? Who cared? A member of the astronomy club? It might be a death sentence for the demons, but in the present, facing the six-family alliance representing Las Vegas, they would only bind their hands and feet. King of Donbua? Compared to the glorious city of desire, Donbua was just an inconspicuous small place. In addition, he was also a classical music teacher in the ivory tower, Russell's secretary, the abyss cooking demon, the calamity musician, the anointed, and even a third-order sublimator that wasn't worth mentioning. But those titles shouldn't appear here. He wasn't here because of that. Then what should he say? He couldn't help but shake his head and laugh softly. It wasn't until now that he realized that perhaps this troublesome job had already been destined the moment Donbua had been tricked by Russell into getting on the bus. So, There was no second answer. For them, there would always be only one person with the greatest strength and capital in the world. At that moment, he calmly raised his eyes and looked forward. Across the bright and luxurious golden table, he stared at the old opponent at the end and calmly told him, "My name is Huai Shi." Huai Shi said, "I'm here on behalf of the celestial genealogy." So in the dead silence, Russell happily stared at those stunned faces. He couldn't help but raise his hand and clap softly, full of joy. It was simply the perfect opening line. "You really are the best student, Huai Shi. You only need simple pointers to understand the essence of the problem. As long as the responsibility is given to you, you will never disappoint. You've already seen through the essence." At this moment, could it be that the ones who came here were an old man and a child? Is it the ivory tower? Or Dambois? No, neither of them. They came here for only one purpose, and they would only run on behalf of the same mission and desire. That was the only reason why they would come here, before these mortals who were intoxicated by vanity, declare to the mortal world that the truth lies. Just like that, after 70 years, the existence of the kingdom of heaven once again appeared in such a formal manner in front of the negotiators. It was calmly announced by a young man. It was as if that glorious era had never left. Instead, it had always existed. It had always existed in the world, and it was just a short rest. But now, those sleeping giants seemed to have woken up with Huai Shi's words. Standing in the darkness behind the long table, together with Huai Shi, they looked forward. They indifferently waited for the other party's response. But a response would not be useful. The trial would not be postponed. Really, the younger generation will surpass us in time. In that torturous silence, there was only the sound of Douglas breathing under the oxygen mask. It was so low, mixed with the noise surging in his lungs. The old man sighed hoarsely, not because of the setback of his plan, but because of himself. It wasn't until this moment that he realized how wrong he was. He had originally thought that his greatest enemy was Luo Su. In order to make Luo Su retreat, he had racked his brains to come up with so many measures and countermeasures. The 2 favors that Russell owed, the 4 promises that he made to people, the support from the Ivy League, and the 5 proposals proposed by Las Vegas. There was always one that would make him waver. There was always one that would reduce the loss to the level that Las Vegas could bear. But he didn't expect that all his preparations and measures were useless, because Russell casually pushed a young man to the front of the stage. She had even taught him how to grasp this power right in front of him, step by step. Now, the nominal power that was enough to cause turmoil was in the hands of Huai Shi, and an opponent more difficult to deal with than Russell became his enemy. When he announced his identity to him, Douglas even wondered if it was really a young man younger than his son. Or was it something more terrifying? Was it Russell's trick? Or was it something else? He didn't know. Because of this, he became more and more uneasy and angry. Because from the beginning to the end, Russell, who was at the other end of the long table, never looked at him directly. His enemy didn't take him seriously at all. Just like 70 years ago, even if he walked on the street with a gun in his hand, wore the most extravagant leather shoes and the most high-profile clothes, and drove a luxury car, no one cared because he was just a nobody. "I've already paid you back, Mr. Russell. I've paid a huge price for this negotiation. I've even shown you so much sincerity. Why do you still want to humiliate me?" He raised his turbid eyes and asked in a hoarse voice, "Do you think that as long as I bring up the name of Heavenly State's lineage, I should raise my hands high and offer Las Vegas to you with both hands?" Russell smiled. He just rested his chin on his hand and didn't say a word. It was as if he didn't hear anything. Huai Shi, on the other hand, didn't seem to care about the consequences. He was eager to try. "Next, I guess I should tell them the consequences of refusing. Aren't you going to try to make a promise?" Russell thought for a moment and shrugged. "Forget it. Although I skipped a part, it doesn't matter. Negotiations are flexible. You should try. You're that assured?" Huai Shi asked. "Yes." Russell smiled. "I'm that assured when it comes to you." Huai Shi thought for a moment and asked, "So it's settled?" "It's settled." Russell nodded, not caring at all. He casually pushed everything to the gambling table. They had a tacit understanding, but everyone only felt that it was ridiculous. It was hard to understand. There must be something wrong with this old thing's brain. How could a normal person have such a negotiation method? Just a word of disagreement and disagreements and a round of poker? As for the consequences they talked about, was there a need to use pale words to explain it? One was one of the few level 5 sublimators in the entire territory, the ruler of the ivory tower. After the fall of the kingdom of heaven, he held on to the last bit of foundation and even began to try to revive it. The other was a disaster sword who had a lot of blood debts since his debut. He had outstanding meritorious deeds and mountains of corpses behind him. He was the favorite of the Astronomical Society and a special military officer who was known as the strongest tool in history. One dared to think and the other dared to do. One dared to teach and the other dared to learn. When the golden wind and the jade dew met, it was better than countless things in the human world. When these two lunatics got together, was there anything they did not dare to do? An old man and a brat who was not even 20 years old came here empty-handed and then opened their big mouths to the rulers here. They wanted to swallow everything and leave nothing behind. They would not compromise for anything. This was not a negotiation at all, but a naked declaration of war. If they could not achieve their goal, they would use all means and even an all-out war between the two sides. Don't you people of the utopia speak reason at all? At the other end of the long table, Douglas gasped hoarsely. His eyes widened in anger, and his sharp voice was so loud. We have made our greatest efforts and sacrifices for peace. But do you really think that we are weak and can be bullied? Las Vegas is not afraid of war. Both of you. He retorted hoarsely. We will never sit still and wait for death. This city is our blood, sweat, and tears, and we will never take half a step back. You can give it a try. If you want to fight to the death, then so be it. Even if we have to bleed to the last drop of blood and spend the last cent of our savings, we will never bow our heads. Why do you have to be so pitiful, old man? Huaisher laughed and did not even bother to lift his eyelids. It's as if we asked for your opinion from the beginning, as if you weren't talking to yourself from the beginning. Today, you bowed your head not to pay for the mistakes of the past, but to protect everything you have now. He said, I have seen many people like you. In Dongxia, we call such people deadbeats. They rely on their relationships and connections to occupy things that do not belong to them. They despise the law, belittle the efforts and dignity of others, and think that they have mastered the rules of this world, but they are not. If one day the hammer falls, they will become incomparably humble and pitiful again. They will have sincerity and restraint, and they will begin to yearn for peace again. It's as if all this is not what they should bear. Thus, looking at his livid face, Huaisher told him coldly, the reason why you admit your mistakes is just to avoid losses. You say you are sincere, but in fact, you only think about yourself. You took us to the military base in America and gave us some prepared leftovers so that we, the uninvited guests, would leave quickly. You think you are showing your sincerity. However, from the beginning until now, I have not even heard a word of sorry from your mouth. However, now that things have come to this, you actually say that we are unreasonable? Huaisher shook his head and laughed. For so many years, the truth has been there, but no one has said it. Now that we've brought it here, has it suddenly become precious? If you want reason, Mr. Douglas, I will give you reason. Huaisher told him coldly, together with war. Chapter 9:36. He did not leave any room for negotiation, nor did he give the old man who was pretending to be in a sorry state any room for negotiation. When Huaisher sat at the negotiating table, no, earlier than that, when the old man in front of him thought that he had offered his sincerity, when Russell got off the plane with Huaisher and came to this city, all of this was destined. Whether his attitude was bad, polite, or gentle, there would be no difference in what happened next. There were only two choices left for the other party. Yes or no? This represented the fundamental position of the ivory tower as the orthodox inheritance of the utopia. At the same time, it was also the crucial first step in the reconstruction of celestial genealogy. If they encountered a setback here, then what happened next would simply be a joke. It was just like if Huaishur did not sell the first step for the ivory tower in the present, everything else would not exist. Rome, the Russian Federation, Eastern Xia, Egypt, and even the Americas, the P5, the five major genealogies, the whole world, and even the remnants of the utopia were all watching their actions. They held the chips in their hands, witnessing their actions. Was there a need to rebuild celestial genealogy when they could not even deal with a deadbeat for Las Vegas? Wouldn't it be better to go back, wash up, and sleep early? It was absolutely impossible to retreat. There was only one choice left for Huaishur, and that was to win. He had to win. He had to win beautifully, so that no one could say anything about it. Otherwise, no matter how much money he got, it would just be the travel expenses for the loser to go home. Russell, on the other hand, was not afraid at all. He did not seem to be worried at all. He just sat by the side and quietly enjoyed his performance. He was full of confidence and anticipation. In the silence, only Douglas' hoarse breathing could be heard. It seems that the ivory tower wants to start with us first. He seemed to have finally figured everything out and could not help but sneer. Aren't you afraid of breaking your teeth? Huaishur grinned. It was unknown if he was mocking or simply wanted to show off his neat and white teeth. It's not the ivory tower. It's celestial genealogy. Las Vegas will never be trampled on by others, then rise up and resist. Huaishur solemnly suggested, mobilize your connections, squander your money, hire your troops, recruit your lackeys, prepare your troops and horses, and rest on your spears for the dawn of the day. Before that happens, close your cities, close your shops, and stop your businesses. Tell every resident here what they're going to face, and tell everyone who comes here what's going to happen. Destroy everything you have before we take it from you. Huaishur chuckled softly. This is also a kind of mutual destruction. It was just like the bubble that Russell had once mocked. Even though Huaishur longed for prosperity and prosperity from the bottom of his heart, he had never thought that Donbua would become like this. Casinos, erotic services, luxury goods, insatiable desires, and never enough money. This was not a city, but a giant adult amusement park, a dream factory built to satisfy human desires. Relying on its unique position and the unprecedented opportunity to build the city of desire from the very beginning, it was not a place that could make people feel like they belonged. It was too easy to destroy the city. It was so easy that there was no need for a war at all. It only needed a signal of the coming war. No other external forces were used, and no soldiers were needed. This city gathered because of desire would also collapse because of desire. Indeed, in the present situation, it was difficult to use the ivory tower. But when Huaishur pushed them to the edge of the cliff, they would understand that once the war began, regardless of success or failure, they had already lost. Even if they had abundant financial resources, even if they had many treasures. It seems that you understand this better than I do, don't you? Huaishur stared at the old man and the people behind him. You are not willing to bear the consequences, nor are you willing to face the outcome. You can't pay the accounts you once owed, and you can't face the tragic outcome. Because of the combination of wealth and interests, you think you are allies, but in fact, you are just grasshoppers tied to the same rope. As soon as the flame starts to ignite, you will drag the burned rope and go your separate ways. Russell is not willing to negotiate with you because this negotiation has not had any problems from the beginning. You think that by destroying jade and common stone, you can make us hesitate, but from the beginning to the end, we only need to use you to express our determination. He finally paused for a moment and told them. Now, you can give your answer, he asked coldly. When will the war between us begin? A month, a week? Or now? In the dead silence, Douglas's expression twitched. After a long time, he seemed to have finally made up his mind. He closed his eyes. There will be no war, Huaishur. When the door opened with a bang, a familiar voice sounded. As long as America still exists. At that moment, Douglas's tense body relaxed, and he let out a long breath. Russell tilted his head and lit his third cigar of the day. He was not surprised by the unfolding in front of him at all. Instead, he had expected it. After all, There was no reason in the world that would dare to let them repeatedly jump at the door. Only Huaishi's expression froze. The look in his eyes was indescribably complicated. After a long time, he rubbed his eyebrows and sighed softly. "Long time no see, Liz," he said. "How have you been?" The girl walked into the vault with an indifferent expression. She was wearing a red coat that represented noble blood. As if she was patrolling her own territory, she looked down at everything in front of her arrogantly. "I'm fine," she said from the bottom of her heart. "But I hope you're not. Things are unpredictable, aren't they?" Huaisha shrugged and turned to glare at Russell. He suspected that this was also within the old bastard's expectations. However, Russell turned into a polar bear again. He looked innocent, as if he didn't know what he was talking about, which made him gnash his teeth in anger. "America respects the ideas and decisions of the Ivory Tower, but we will never allow the Astronomy Club to violate the amendment and interfere with the internal affairs of the present state." Liz sat down at the other end of the long table and naturally took over the negotiating position. She told Huaisha, "We will never give up any rights on our own territory." This was Douglas's saving grace. Reinforcements from the American lineage. After lobbying many members of Parliament and noble blood, promising many benefits and rewards, the protection in exchange. By chance, they had invited the person Huaisha didn't want to face the most. This was the worst result. Under Liz's cold and threatening gaze, Huaisha guiltily averted her gaze. He bowed his head to the victim. However, before Douglas had time to rejoice at Huaisha's weak performance, he heard the voice on the other side. "We're old acquaintances, and we've been through so much together. Don't you want to avoid it because of the benefits?" In an instant, the old man's smile froze on his face. He turned to look at Liz beside him in shock, and then looked at Huaisha's helpless expression. The more he looked, the more he felt that something was wrong. The scumbag's eyes were honest with guilt, and the serious expression of recognition with resentment. These two people, it seemed, maybe there's something wrong? "Avoid it?" Liz sneered. "Huaisha, do you still need to avoid it?" "I have a conscience. I still have to avoid it when it's necessary." Huaisha sighed and spread his hands. "I'm begging for mercy. Can we talk to someone else?" "In your dreams." Liz leaned on the chair and looked up at him. "Do you want to change your head? I recommend you to a hospital run by a Skinner. They're skilled. In 5 minutes, your head can be turned into a wine glass, the kind with goblets. That good? If you have time, we can talk about it together." Huaisha smiled and looked at the girl in front of him. He asked curiously, "So, who are we talking to, Liz? If I represent celestial genealogy, then who are you representing? The Ivy League?" He paused and said teasingly, "Or the American genealogy? As a noble of American blood, I've been given full authority to deal with this matter," Liz said calmly. "What I say is equivalent to what the American genealogy says. Don't you think this is a coincidence?" Huaisha spread his hands and shrugged. He glanced at Russell behind him meaningfully. "Old bastard, do you look familiar? Why are everyone's ideas and routines the same these days? You don't even care about such a big matter, and you want to find an agent?" Just like that, you casually handed over the task of establishing the future relationship between the American genealogy and celestial genealogy to the two new generations. You're too careless. Russell was still in a state of excitement. He smoked, drank beer, and even took a bucket of popcorn from somewhere. He was already in a state of excitement. It was as if he was watching a show and didn't mind the drama. Fight. He really couldn't count on this old guy. Huaisha shook his head and sighed. He said to Liz, "In that case, it seems that I can talk to someone higher up than you." "There's no higher up, Huaisha," Liz retorted indifferently. "The only one who will talk to you is me." "No, there is." Huaisha shrugged and held up the lit screen of his phone with his fingers. On the screen, a phone number was spinning with Huaisha's fingertips. He said, "For me, there's a more suitable one." Liz's expression froze and immediately became colder, because at the top of the number page, a young face was smiling proudly through the screen. "How's your uncle, Mr. Izzy?" Huaisha asked with concern. "We're old acquaintances. Speaking of which, I didn't expect that the high priest of the living God, Mamakiria, would condescend to become my friend." You see, Liz, we always have some fate in strange places. Then I'll have to disappoint you. Why sure, Liz mocked. Liz said mockingly. Although my uncle likes to mess around, he can't do anything when it comes to such a big matter. But he's easy to talk to. Whisher spread his hands and sighed. That's the difference, Liz. Since I'm talking to the American genealogy, why don't I talk to Mr. Izzy? Even if it's a success or a failure, the friendship between the two of us will improve. He paused and smiled mischievously. But if it's the other way around, I'm afraid you won't feel good, right? Chapter 9:37. For a moment, Liz's eyes became colder and colder. As the one who had been given full authority, if Huaishur bypassed her and directly reached an agreement with Izzy, no matter what the outcome was, her position would probably be very awkward. The simplest thing was that it was difficult to get rid of the label of incompetence. Even if Izzy Hector was her uncle and would not embarrass her, who knew what her uncle would do when he lost his mind? After all, Mamakiria was very indulgent of her high priestess. The noble goddess, who was known as the doting mother, liked to raise the children she liked the most. She could be said to be a crazy person, and those who were valued by her, without exception, were almost all rare heroes and villains that were hard to come by in 100 years. Otherwise, there would not be a weirdo like Izzy. What was worse was that what if? Mamakiria felt that Huaishur had a promising future and wanted to train him? When this adoptive mother of the American genealogy sided with an outsider, all the children would be a little overwhelmed. Liz frowned and asked solemnly, "Are you threatening me, Huaishur? You know, I've always respected you." "Okay, sorry, I can understand your unpleasant impression of me. In fact, I really want to apologize to you, and it's not a problem to retreat. But it's a pity that I'm not the only one." Huaishur raised his hands in surrender, thought for a moment, and proposed seriously, "How about this? I've decided to increase the loan amount from the Bank of America for the second phase of Donwa's construction, and I'll give priority to your Rongguan group during the bidding. How about that? I've been wanting to build a luxury hotel in the city center for a long time." "Is this your price?" Liz could not help but laugh. Perhaps this might be a huge etiquette for ordinary people, but for the American genealogy, it was not worth mentioning at all. "Not for the American genealogy, just for you," Huaishur replied solemnly. "No matter what you think, I think I have to apologize to you before we officially start. You can accept it. Well, the old debt between you and me will be settled separately. How about it?" Liz was stunned. "Wow, your name is in my city? Sounds great." Outside the negotiation table, the hidden projection of the feathered serpent chuckled softly. She lamented to Russell beside her. Where did he learn such an extravagant way of apologizing? "I didn't teach him that." White Bear, who was holding a beer, shrugged innocently. "It's probably the nature of scumbags. I learned it all by myself. But it was done beautifully, wasn't it?" Feathered Snake clicked her tongue and sighed. After he expressed his stance, he seized his opponent's weakness to test the pressure. At the same time, he took the initiative to make up for it to prevent his opponent from using it as a pretext to make a fuss. "If I were a normal girl, I would forgive him even if he cheated on me behind my back, haha. Don't look at everyone like a schemer, okay?" Russell sighed. "I think he might just want to apologize. That's the trickiest part, Russell." Feathered Snake shook her head and lamented. "If it was just a simple trick or a negotiation strategy, who would be easily moved by someone with a firm stance? But it's this kind of undisguised kindness and sincerity that makes people feel afraid. It's like the kind of person who is very good to everyone and is very gentle to everyone. He clearly doesn't do it on purpose, but he will give people the illusion that he is special. Such pure kindness, such a sincere attitude, coupled with such a terrifying charisma, from a certain point of view, it was simply dangerous to the extreme. For people who were experienced in the ways of the world, indifferent attitudes and vicious conspiracies were not rare. In this cold world, this was a norm. Therefore, everyone was used to haggling over the smallest details and scheming against each other. And that kind of kindness was like a strong poison. It would make people unknowingly let down their guard and easily open the sealed door, making them fall into a passive state, even if it could not solve the problem fundamentally. But there were many things that could be discussed once the discussion started. Letting Liz preside over the negotiation was precisely the most disadvantageous thing for her. The more familiar people were with Huaishur, the more they should be able to understand the nature of this guy. Anyone who had never dealt with Huaishur before would probably not fall for his tricks. You're also a bad guy. Russell glanced at her from the corner of his eyes. We're the same, aren't we? Feathered Snake shook her head indifferently. I just threw the work of American genealogy to my subordinates, but you bet the debut of celestial genealogy on the students. In terms of courage, I'm not as good as you. Why would a rich man with a big business compete with a poor homeless man in courage? Russell chuckled softly and looked at the negotiation table. Since the chips have been placed, it's up to the children next. Whether it succeeds or not, we can always look forward to the future, right? The future. Feathered Snake sighed softly and said no more. On the negotiation table, Huaishur probed again. Now it seems that we can start the next stage of the negotiation. What? Are you going to name your price and promise your conditions? Liz seemed to have already understood the process that Russell taught her and was not moved. What price do you have to make the American genealogy waiver? Huaishur, don't overestimate yourself. Don't worry, I always know what I'm worth. Huaishur smiled and suddenly asked, I heard that the Ivy League seems to be working on something called the solar ephemeris these years. As soon as he finished speaking, the entire vault was dead silent. Not only Huaishur, but even Douglas felt the chill from Liz's body and that faintly discernible, killing intent. The old man in the wheelchair suddenly changed his expression. His heart twitched. He looked at Huaishur with exceptionally shocked and angry eyes. Even if he did not know what this solar ephemeris was, it was obviously involved in an important project of the American genealogy. It was definitely a secret of secrets. It was obvious that what Huaishur said was not something that fence-sitters like them could hear. Talking about this in front of them was tantamount to putting a knife to their necks. No matter what the consequences were, they were afraid that all of them would have to pay a heavy price. Do you people from the celestial genealogy have no morals at all? He said with a trembling voice. Your Highness, I request to withdraw. There's no need, Mr. Douglas. Liz glanced at him and said expressionlessly, later, just cooperate with the Ivy League to do a memory screening. I only hope that you know how precious my pity is. It was true that, as Huaishur said, the solar ephemeris was a huge project that the Ivy League had been slowly carrying out in secret over the years. In essence, it involved a major secret of the American genealogy and a huge exploration of future strategic plans. It was impossible to make such a huge project completely airtight, but rumors were only limited to the top of the P5 and the high-level members of the Astronomy Association. Just like the location of the Dragon Vein in Dongxia, the location of the Holy Coffin in the Russian Federation, the land of the wolf's blood in Rome, and the secret tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs. Not to mention knowing the content. If one was not qualified enough, even hearing the name would be sentenced to life imprisonment or even physical destruction. In this regard, the smiling guy on the opposite side was completely clear. He simply didn't like this old man and wanted to torment him a little. But Liz did not intend to let him have his way. Huaishur, I admire the Ivory Tower's intelligence channels, but this is not something that can be casually discussed. Liz warned word by word. You have to understand what you are saying. Now let's talk about something that can be said. Huaishur propped up his chin and happily changed the topic. For example, the immortal machine that you took away from the Twilight Village. He had personally participated in the entire process of the Twilight Village's closure. How could he not know what the Ivy League had done and what they had taken away? It was just that after destroying the Eternal Core, he was too lazy to pursue those details. Moreover, he was not worried that the Ivy League would abuse such technology. Behind the American genealogy stood 1.5 living gods. God knew how many hells belonged to them in the dark. Mutants, which could be seen everywhere, did not have any psychological pressure to consume them. Only an idiot would experiment on a living person. In this regard, he had already inferred after communicating with the Grandmaster Mikhail. The Ivy League most likely wanted to crack these technologies and apply them on the solar ephemeris. But the Grandmaster was also confused about the solar ephemeris. He only guessed, based on the clues over a long period of time, that it was most likely a strategic hell weapon of the American genealogy. If it could be combined with an energy device like the Immortal Machine, it would certainly be of great benefit, right? Don't worry, I'm not interested in that kind of thing, and I don't intend to get it back from the Americans. Don't look at me like this. There are still people in the Continuation Academy who owe me a favor. Fleischer knocked on the table and continued. But you must have a headache, right? There's no progress in reverse cracking or anything. Although the art of forging and alchemy are of the same level, the Immortal Machine is highly linked to the Eternal Core, and it's not so easy to deal with. When he smiled, his expression was particularly gloating. As the only forger in the present realm, Fleischer knew all too well. The Immortal Machine was indeed unable to bring true immortality. It only transformed the user into an eternity of suffering, unable to escape from the sludge. But in essence, this was the technology of turning a solidified soul into a source battery. It was a renewable and pollution-free energy source. It definitely involved more than the technology of one Forger King. Not to mention how difficult it was to reproduce all this without the cooperation of the Sunmaker. It's been so long. How much have you grasped? Fleischer guessed. 10%? 20? No, with the Ivy League's technical ability, it should be about 70%, right? He paused for a moment and said solemnly, "Please tell the researchers that they've reached the limits of alchemy's simulation and understanding so quickly, as expected of the Ivy League. Unfortunately, the next step is not in the field of alchemy. That was the great crystallization of the forgers. It'd not be easy to replicate it." Liz retorted indifferently. "We can solve it." "Yes, definitely. Nothing in the world is difficult. I'm afraid it's cost-effective. But are you willing to invest so many resources to gamble on the results? In fact, as long as there's a Grandmaster in the right field, it's not a problem at all. But which Grandmaster would be willing to change his research direction for this kind of thing and then spend more than 40 years to study it again? Especially since there were 2 Grandmasters missing recently. They were simply short of manpower. No matter how big the American genealogy was, it was impossible for them to squander and use up Grandmasters like tools like the Ascendants for this kind of thing. So, at this time, a kind-hearted person who was passing by and happened to be the only forger in the world made a suggestion. Fleischer smiled, revealing 8 perfect and shining teeth. "Do you need help?" Instantly, Douglas's expression changed, and he opened his mouth to speak. But the invisible pressure in the air pressed down on his declining consciousness, making it difficult for him to make a sound. Only his heart was ice cold. Chapter 938. Liz glanced to Fleischer and suddenly asked, "What? Is the Sunmaker behind you bound by fate and willing to join the American lineage? Or are you planning to change your allegiance? If that's the case, I don't mind helping you write a report." "You're already bargaining?" Fleischer spread his hands regretfully. "Sorry, don't even think about the Sunmaker. I'm quite comfortable in the ivory tower. Sending an employee like me out may be the limit of what the boss can accept. If you know too many corporate secrets and want to change jobs, you'll be hunted down by the espionage eradication team. Let's take a step back. How about I give you a complete set of secret manuals and guides? The kind that you can easily clear the level by following the instructions? Then it seems that you can't make all the decisions." Liz mocked. Liz mocked before suddenly saying, 60 blacksmiths. We will provide you with apprentice alchemists. You only need to train them into blacksmiths. You don't need to win the rest. Isn't there an archive of Sunmaker's techniques in the Astronomy Society?" Fleischer asked. "Can't you just read that? If reading books is useful, what do we need teachers for?" Liz asked. "Besides, don't tell me you think that others can't see that you're hiding something." Fleischer shook his head. "Look at what you're saying. I've already given you the foundation and information for free. There's no reason for me to hand over my unique application techniques, right? Also, 60 is too many. What's the use of having so many? If you want to focus on training, 10 is enough. This isn't a market haggling, why sure. Liz had no intention of backing down. It wasn't as if the Ivy League hadn't trained their own sunmakers. Benefiting from the excellent potential that Huaishur had shown, everyone had more or less arranged for some people to study him. Anyway, the family business was big, and some people had nothing to do. Arranging some after-school activities could also enrich the fun of their lives. Then, everyone realized that they might not be playing the same game as Huaishur. Without the alchemy, fire, metal specialization, and all kinds of blessings, even the first obstacle needed time to overcome. Without a mature forger to make a forgery furnace for the apprentices, they could only endure more than 10 times the time and slow efficiency, crawling at the speed of a tortoise. As for the techniques and high-end application methods that were not recorded in the basic teaching materials, who knew how long it would take to figure them out? 50 to 70 was the best range that Ivy League came up with after considering the time and manpower. Too much of it was useless, and too little of it was useless. If that's the case, it's impossible for everyone to have a casting furnace, Liz. Huaishur said, and you have to provide the materials, many of which even the ivory tower doesn't have in stock. Then, how many times do you want me to reimburse you? How is this possible? Huaishur patted his chest sincerely. You have to believe in my character. Liz sneered. To be honest, I don't mind such a small amount of things, and I don't intend to hide these techniques in a drawer as treasures, but it's not cost-effective for you to do this. Huaishur sighed. It will take at least a few decades to train your own people and wait for them to understand the king of forgery's techniques and be able to cooperate with your scholars and alchemists to reverse engineer it. Look at me. I've done it in a few seconds. Why bother? But under Liz's insistence, Huaishur could only give in helplessly. She doesn't even understand that it's better to buy than to buy, and it's better to rent than to buy. This wastrel woman. Forget it. I'll just sell them a few castrated versions. They won't be able to tell anyway. Then, let's talk about something else. After settling this cooperation project between the Ivy League and the Ivory Tower, Huaishur casually reminded, the assets of the Utopia should not be abused. Treasures of heaven and earth should be owned by the virtuous. Good things should be held in the hands of good people. Liz looked at him deeply and emphasized, America will not sell its land. Of course, strengthening ties, deep cooperation, and close cooperation will definitely be the main theme of both sides. Huaishur understood and suggested with a smile. As an outsider, Celestial Genealogy has no intention of telling America's cities what to do. As an investor, I prefer to do nothing and just take money. Of course, for the sake of a win-win situation for both sides, some chaos in the city must be rectified. As long as there's money, there's no land. The seat of the independent city-states in the United States of America is open to all who want it, but only if I give my consent. Liz immediately emphasized the property of America's citizens is sacred and inviolable. Of course, the interests of investors should be guaranteed. I even think that we should get more investment from the outside world to come up with something new here. It's boring to always be in the casino. If you ask me, we should develop in all aspects of morality, intelligence, physical beauty, and labor. To be honest, I've already started planning for the greening of the desert. Huaishur raised his hands high, full of sunshine. We are willing to join hands with the residents to build a more colorful dream city. The investment of the nobles remained unchanged and could even be increased. Don't worry, fellow townsfolk, we Celestial Genealogy only want money. We don't kill people. If there's money, everyone earns it together. How shameful is it to eat alone? The more people who drink the soup, the harder it is to overturn the pot. But don't think that you can control my project too much, right? Liz solemnly emphasized again, traditions and human rights must be protected. Of course, every soul is born free and noble. Huaishur answered without hesitation. We respect every skin color and every ethnic group. Even the beast type will be treated fairly here. It doesn't matter if you move Native Americans, Aztecs, or even Roman immigrants here. I have the beast type here. Are you afraid? Huaisha wasn't sleepy. As the king of Donbua, he was born to stand on the moral high ground of political correctness. He looked down and hit whoever he wanted. As long as he was willing, he could spit at the top of the mountain and say that this place was too high, and there would be hundreds of thousands of beast types coming out to help him flatten it. Following the two's questions and answers, Douglas' heart sank to the bottom of the valley little by little. It was as if he was witnessing the interrogation of his son-in-law and father-in-law with his own eyes. It looked serious, cold, and hostile, but in fact, with every question the father-in-law asked and every answer the son-in-law gave, everyone was one step closer to a predetermined result. How much is your income? Do you have a house? Do you have a car? What are your job prospects? The answers to every question were above standard and even beyond expectations. Next, they only needed to match their birthdays and see their horoscopes. Then, everyone could happily and harmoniously imagine a beautiful future together. Other than the fact that the daughter to be married off was from the Douglas family, there was no problem at all. Both parties didn't seem to care about this at all. When Liz stood in front of the negotiating table, the result was no longer in his control. Finally, when the conversation at the negotiating table came to an end, Liz looked deeply at Huaisha and reminded him, "In this land, every transaction will be witnessed by the gods." Huaisha, I hope you can keep your promise. Celestial genealogy will not let any friend down. Huaisha smiled and reached out his hand. Happy working with you. Liz's fingers were slender and strong, as firm as iron. She retracted her hand after touching Huaisha. But before she left, she looked at him one last time. I hope so. From this moment on, the American genealogy was the first to end their observation. They chose to bet. They participated in this huge gamble triggered by Russell. 10 minutes later, this news would spread throughout the world and be placed in front of every observer. The reconstruction of celestial genealogy took a crucial step forward, and it was in Huaisha's hands. It was in his control. And now, the war had not yet come, and this city that was born because of a mistake 70 years ago was about to welcome its new owner. For many people, there was no doubt that dark clouds covered the sky and a storm was coming. And some people seemed to see an opportunity to make a move in ecstasy. However, Huaisha did not care about the endless glory and extravagance that came with it. Was it fun? Could it be more fun than tricking students? He had to think about it for 5 minutes just to buy a monthly card. Financial numbers games had never meant anything to Huaisha, just like this city in front of him. It belonged to him. Then he would take a look at it after opening the box and putting it in the cabinet. Its purpose was to put it together with other things. Such a troublesome matter, he would leave it to Russell to deal with. Anyway, he did not want to get involved at all. However, before leaving the vault, he suddenly remembered that there was one last thing he had to do. Thus, Huaisha stopped in his tracks, turned around, and looked at the weak old man in the wheelchair beside him. Beside the wheelchair, the young man with a livid face stared at him. After a long time, he no longer had the courage to look away. In the silence, only the old man's tired and difficult breathing could be heard under the oxygen mask. "This is your last chance, old sir," Huaisha reminded him calmly. "If you want to fight to the death, now is the only time." In the wheelchair, Douglas closed his eyes in despair. There was only one choice left. Thus, he no longer hesitated. When his turbid eyes looked up again, Douglas had already knelt at Huaisha's feet and praised him sincerely. "Mr. Huaisha, Las Vegas will swear loyalty to you." "Very good." Huaisha nodded approvingly. He reached out and pressed on his skinny shoulders, announcing softly, "Then remember, Mr. Douglas, the current you is already stepping on the land of the utopia. Perhaps you will be dissatisfied and resentful of everything that happens in the future, but you have to understand one thing." Huaisha lowered his head and reminded him kindly in his ear, "You are living because of this." In the long silence, Huaisha turned around and her footsteps faded into the distance. On the ground, Douglas dragged the cumbersome oxygen equipment. He was sweating profusely and lowered his head deeply, not daring to raise it again. When Huaishir walked out of the base with his suit jacket, he saw Russell leaning against the car and whistling. In the vast desert, the polar bear was smoking a cigar and humming an old jazz song happily. Huaishir rolled his eyes at him and asked angrily, "Haven't you thought about what if I fail?" "Then wait for the right time and try again." Russell waved his hand casually. "You're still young. There will definitely be a chance in the future." "What if I fail too?" Huaishir asked. "Huh? Don't you have students of your own? But forget about that brat from the Lin family. I think more highly of that girl, Yuan. You should increase your efforts to nurture her. It can't be because she's a girl, right?" Huaishir glanced at him from the corner of his eyes. Russell was stunned and looked over with a puzzled expression. Chapter 9:39. Half a month later, in the Baikal Mountains of the central Siberian plateau, a cold wind blew from the distant snowy mountains. Under his dog fur hat, Huaishir raised his head and breathed out hot air. The bonfire in front of him crackled, and sparks danced in the air. In the clay pot hanging over the fire, the unseasoned mutton soup gurgled. Huaishir sighed and took out a paper bag from his pocket. He sprinkled some of the rock salt he had scraped off after running for 2 kilometers. Then he skimmed off the foam with a wooden spoon and covered it with a lid before continuing to stew. Under the piles of rocks that blocked the wind, on the hillside that had a hint of green, dirty sheep were gnawing on the grass with their heads lowered. The old shepherd with a walking stick and a fur coat was smoking his own tobacco leaves and talking to Russell. The two of them seemed to be talking and laughing, and burst into laughter from time to time. The corners of Huaishir's eyes twitched. "Is there something wrong with your celestial genealogy people's brains?" They either ran to Nara to feed deer, closed their doors to play Genesis, or ran to the wilderness to herd sheep. Each one was wilder than the last, especially the old man in front of him. It was said that he hadn't set foot in a city for 30 years. He took care of all his food, clothing, and shelter himself. If he hadn't died, it could only be said that the sublimator's physique was excellent. Once people started to let go of themselves, they would become all kinds of strange things. It was like a homebody who didn't go out all year round. After a long time, problems would most likely occur. At first, Huaishir didn't understand what kind of person would need a helicopter airdrop just to meet him. When he first saw the old man, he thought he had met a savage and was about to take out his phone to take a picture. But the old man rolled his eyes and glared at him, and the signal disappeared. His full battery signal instantly disappeared. 5 minutes before he arrived, his phone ran out of battery. An hour later, Huaishir found that Russell's watch was disintegrating. 2 hours later, they didn't have a single modern thing left on them. Even the bank cards in their wallets had been erased. Fortunately, he didn't use the half-monthly wish function of his saddlebag. Otherwise, he would have to run naked in the wilderness. In Huaishir's opinion, the old man was not an alchemist at all. He was simply an EMP that targeted civilization, a high-tech electronic device killer. If he was really allowed to take a stroll in the city, who knew how much trouble he would cause? The most important thing was that although he was a little too biased, he was still a top alchemist. Yet he still couldn't figure out how the old man did it. It was as if his very existence was a poison against civilization, a mobile electronic disaster. Could this be celestial genealogy's strategic weapon? Was it to throw him into the enemy's camp? Just as the soup was about to be cooked, the two of them ended their conversation and walked towards the tent. He could vaguely see the shepherd's solemn expression, as well as a hint of relief. If that's the case, then I have no reason to refuse. The old man opened his mouth and threw the last bit of the cigarette into his mouth. He chewed on the tobacco and the sparks and asked casually, "Have you been to Kadia's place?" Russell's expression froze. "You asked a good question." The shepherd retracted his gaze. "You have to know that as long as the two of you are still alive, you can't avoid this question." Russell didn't say anything. Only Huaishir blinked his eyes curiously. Who was Kadia? Was she the old man's enemy? But why did the name sound like a woman? If the Russian Federation had a name, then Kadia's full name should be Catherine. This. Huaisher took a deep breath in front of the soup pot and pretended to smell it. His heart was filled with curiosity. But after that, the two of them didn't talk about this matter anymore. This made him feel like his heart was being scratched by 100 claws. He was extremely curious. After finishing the discussion and drinking the soup, Luo Su patted his butt and left. On the way down the mountain, Huaisher asked, "Where are we going next?" He felt that this trip was full of excitement. It was like going out to catch a Pokemon. However, after wandering around for so long, from Yingzhou to America, and then taking a big detour to the Russian Federation, even Huaisher felt a little homesick. "What's wrong? Tired?" Russell asked. "I'm fine." Huaisher looked at the leather jacket and trousers he was wearing. "I just hope you can tell me where we're going next time, so that I can change my clothes first." "Don't worry, Huaisher." Russell twirled the lighter in his hand, looking somewhat helpless. "Next, besides a few insignificant problems, there are only two more troublesome areas." He paused for a moment and suddenly asked, "Rome and Egypt, which one do you prefer?" Huaisher thought for a moment. "Since you suddenly said that, of course I choose." "Of course you choose Egypt, right?" Russell looked at him and suddenly became happy. "It's just a joke to liven up the atmosphere. Isn't Miss Fu Yi doing an internship recently? You won't be able to see her in Rome. So what's the hurry? If you ask me, why don't we go to London and let Miss AI be a tour guide and enjoy the atmosphere of the Astronomy Society headquarters? Or should we go around the border of the Darknet and visit the Three Wise Men? Or India? I heard that Miss Luo surpassed her father a few days ago and passed 3 of the 6 trials. Aya, the future is really promising." The corners of Huaisher's eyes twitched wildly. He didn't want to go anywhere. The premonition of death kept reminding him that wherever he went, there would be a bloody disaster. "Can't you hope for me a little better?" And just as they were chatting, Russell's smile stiffened. He stopped in his tracks. "What's wrong?" Huaisher asked. "Aren't we going to Egypt? Why aren't we going?" Russell looked up at the end of the sky and sighed. "It seems that there's no need." Huaisher was puzzled. "We were a step too slow." The old bastard shrugged helplessly, tilted his head, lit a cigar, and sighed softly. "Someone has already come to pick us up." In just a few short seconds, Yi Zichen was stunned. A pale white color rose from the end of the sky, from the deepest part of the distant mountains, and danced above the vault of heaven. It was like a swirling white chain. Huaisher's eyes widened, and he felt his scalp go numb. It was a storm, a vortex formed by the storm in the sky. The terrifying storm swept up countless snowflakes and swooped down from the cold plateau. The scale of the storm was unbelievably huge. However, as it moved forward, it quickly shrank. In the end, it turned into a snow-colored tornado that rolled in the sky like a furious dragon. It was whistling towards them. "Wow." The shepherd popped his head out from the grass beside him. "It's so fast." "Bastard, did you betray me?" Russell questioned. The shepherd was stunned for a moment, and he was amused. "What did I betray you with? My phone? Mobile phone? Wireless internet?" Still relying on my loud voice, I stood on top of the mountain and shouted in the direction of Ural. "Look, Katia, that bastard Russell is here." The old shepherd snorted and spread out his hands. "Please, she is the old godmother of the Russian Federation, Gaia of the Storm. Every snowflake here has her name, and every strand of frost is her hair. You have stepped into the territory of the Russian Federation. Do you think you can hide from her eyes?" Luo Su was furious. "I've already blocked it. I unblocked it. What are you going to do about it?" The shepherd replied in a bad mood. "Russell, you have to face problems." At that moment, the storm whistled down from the vault of heaven. Huaisher's scalp went numb. In the face of this terrifying disaster that seemed to cover the entire vault of heaven and earth, he subconsciously lowered his head and lay down, preparing to withstand the terrifying impact. However, the storm brushed past his body from both sides. It was too lazy to pay attention to a character like him who couldn't be taken lightly. When Huaisher looked up, he found that Russell had disappeared. Except for the old bastard, he did not take a single blade of grass or leaf with him. Wow. Alice's adventure in the Discovery. Huaisher was stunned for a long time, and he could not help but sigh. He sincerely hoped that the old bastard could find the Tin Lion and the Scarecrow when he reincarnated in the other world and never come back. But then, he started to feel numb again. What should I do? You probably, maybe were left here? The shepherd was gloating. He has some old grudges to deal with. Maybe it will be a little troublesome. It's not convenient for you to show up. Huaisher was puzzled. How troublesome? The shepherd thought for a while and said seriously, It's troublesome to collect debts from your ex-girlfriend. Huaisher was shocked by this huge amount of information, and he shook his head. Forget it. But Russell, that old bastard, owed 350 million yuan from eating, drinking, and gambling. Celestial genealogy was not reorganized halfway, and he died. Where would he go? Back to Damboa? I see that you have nothing to do. Why don't you help me herd the sheep? The shepherd excitedly proposed. I see that your mutton soup is very good. Why don't you help me? And I'll teach you the primordial curse technique. I have the interest of surviving in the wilderness. Why would I come to the Russian Federation? Before Huaisher could respond, he heard the howling of the storm in the sky. The ghastly white tornado came back again. It was as if he remembered that he forgot to bring the car key. It suddenly came back and swallowed him in an instant. When the storm dissipated, Huaisher had disappeared. Only the shepherd was left standing in the same place, stunned, and looked up at the sky. Hey, Katia, you should take me with you. I haven't been out for many years. No one responded. Only the bleating sound of a herd of silly sheep galloping past. The sky was far away from the highlands. In the storm, Huaisher didn't feel the dizziness that he expected. It was just like a blur in front of his eyes. From the mountains, he came to a strange city. In all directions, there were high walls of factories and smoke rising into the sky from countless chimneys. Cars roared past him, and the bells in the church in front of him rang. A flock of white pigeons in the square was startled. Pedestrians holding coffee hurried to and fro. Huaisher looked around blankly, still wearing a leather jacket, pants, and a leather hat. He looked like a bear that broke into the city. Where is this? The capital of the Ural Industrial District. In front of the church, the black-clothed priest who was ordered to wait here replied, Mr. Huaisher, welcome to the Russian Federation. Chapter 940. In the hot summer wind, Huaisher couldn't help but take off his dogskin hat and start fanning himself. He was a little surprised. In the blink of an eye, he went from the central Siberian plateau to the other side of the Russian Federation. Is it that magical? Huaisher was stunned for a moment, then looked at the church in front of him before he reacted. Where is this? Ekaterinburg, the priest said, you are in the blood-dripping church, which belongs to the Russian Federation. Huaisher suddenly felt numb again. All the important offices and branches of the Russian Federation were in the form of churches throughout the country or overseas, especially in industrial areas like the Ural region. The importance of the blood-dripping church, which was second to none in the capital, was obvious. Why was he suddenly thrown in front of the Public Security Bureau? Did he commit a crime again? Forget about that dog Russell smuggling himself in. He even implicated him. He subconsciously wanted to say 3 words in a row, but before he introduced himself, he reacted. That's not right. Even if he didn't go through customs, as an action member of the Astronomical Society and a special military officer, he had the right to pass through the present territory. As long as he was in the present territory, the national border was almost nothing to him. At most, he could send a text message to the local branch to report. What's there to be afraid of? He coughed awkwardly and asked, Well, where's the old man who came with me? The bishop and Mr. Russell have something important to discuss. The priest replied politely. Please wait for a moment. How about I entertain you? Bishop, the corner of Huaisher's eyes twitched. Well, this wave was directly intercepted by the higher-ups of the Russian Federation. The old bastard Russell was happy to have his boat capsized. But since the other party didn't throw a cup as a signal and jump out 300 holy knights to sharpen their knives, it meant that he was still safe. As for Russell, worrying about him was better than worrying about whether he had turned off the tap when he went out. After he sorted out the situation in front of him, he instantly calmed down. His gaze turned back to the middle-aged priest in black with a beard in front of him. He realized that the ordinary-looking priest in front of him was actually wearing a sword-shaped holy emblem. He really was a Templar knight. "Excuse me, may I know your name?" Huaisher stretched out his hand. "Alexei Antonov. Just call me Alexei." The priest shook his hand and turned around to lead the way. "Please follow me." In this way, he led Huaisher all the way to the door of the church. After passing through the hall, he turned right and walked to the back hall. Along the way, Huaisher also saw many believers praying and tourists excitedly taking photos as souvenirs. It was hard to imagine that such a place was actually an important town and branch of a system. "Are there usually so many people here?" Huaisher asked. "After all, it's a famous tourist attraction. There will be more tourists during the holidays, but those who come are all believers, so it's not good to reject them. Moreover, this is also a necessary way to expand our influence and recruit new blood." Alexei explained calmly and opened the elevator door for Huaisher. When the door opened again, he saw an office-like hall with staff coming in and out, as well as cubicles. It was quite a corporate atmosphere. However, everyone here more or less wore rosary beads and holy emblems on their bodies. Even if there were no slogans on the wall, and there were not many religious displays, the atmosphere was still strong. Noticing Huaisher, who looked like a bear strolling through the streets, many people did not find it strange. Many people even greeted Alexei. It could be seen that he was highly regarded and had a high level of authority. "Orthodoxy," Huaisher sighed. "This is the first time I've seen it. It's just faith. In front of celestial genealogy, there's nothing strange about it," Alexei replied calmly. Alexei answered calmly and opened the door for him. In the lounge, there was already a new set of clothes on the table, from the inside to the outside, including the shoes. "There's not much time. We only had time to find these clothes from the warehouse. If the size is not suitable, please let me know. I'll come back later. The Wi-Fi password is on the wall. Please don't hesitate to serve the tea and snacks on the table." After considerately leaving Huaisher some personal space, Alexei closed the door for him. Huaisher was left in the room, looking around. It was obvious that this was a guest room specially used to entertain guests. The decoration was simple, revealing the usual simplicity of the Russian Federation. It was also very clean and spotless. After changing his clothes, Huaisher stuffed the messy clothes into his bag, sat on the sofa, and pulled out a holy book from the bookshelf next to him to read. It had not changed at all from 400 years ago. After pretending to be Van Helsing for so long, Huaisher could recite it backwards. Needless to say, staying in this room was quite familiar. After 400 years, even the display of the guest room had not changed much, except for the addition of the Wi-Fi. After all, it was the Orthodox inheritance of the Holy Spirit pedigree. Hundreds of years ago, when the rancher was born and the gods fell, the Holy Spirit pedigree also fell apart. During that chaotic period, the predecessor of the Astronomical Society, the Pioneer Society, united the major pedigrees to re-establish the foundation of the present realm, thus forming the embryonic form of the Astronomical Society. The Holy Spirit pedigree also ushered in a complete split. After Rome inherited the heritage, they chose to learn from their mistakes and unified the important components of the Roman pedigree, the Greek pedigree, and so on. They formed the Pantheon system led by the Hall of Kings, which isolated the ranchers' spying and interference. Another part of the priests who were unwilling to disintegrate the god of nothingness guarded the relics and heritage of the Holy Spirit pedigree, resisting the erosion of the abyss. They gradually fell into madness, or turned into fanatics of the rancher. In the end, after the leaders of the many churches held the fourth conference in history in Constantinople, they decided to move to the east. Under the escort of the Knights Templar, the priests carried the last heritage of the Holy Spirit pedigree and the remains of the saints and began to move eastward. In the end, they re-established their foothold in this land. Now, it had become the official body of the Russian Federation pedigree. After inheriting the essence of the Holy Spirit pedigree and most of the relics, the Russian Federation pedigree could be said to have a deep heritage, especially among the various pedigrees, the #1 military equipment. According to statistics, the resident major sublimated knights and the Blessed Armored Priest Legion had more than 100,000 people, not to mention the other reserve troops and the reserve priests in various temples all over the country. Without such a large scale, it would not be able to support the crusade against the rancher every 20 years. To a certain extent, the birth of the celestial genealogy was also influenced by the Russian Federation. After all, this group of people used practical actions to prove that as long as one had enough cultivation, even the position of nothingness could be turned into a divine seat. Using an origin code like the sacred scripture to create a sacred spirit was truly breathtaking. Sorry to keep you waiting. When Alexei returned, he brought a full set of documents for Huai Shi, including a passport and a driver's license. In the following time, you can move freely in Ekaterinburg. If you don't like to be alone, we also have a driver and an assistant for you. No need. Huai Shi waved his hand. I'll just stay here. Although he did not want to care about Russell's affairs, the old bastard was still his direct leader and teacher. After he disappeared, Huai Shi was not in the mood to wander around. It was better to just lie in the room and have a good rest and wait for news. After all, even if the negotiations with Russell fell through, he would not lose a single hair. Alexei thought for a moment and nodded. In that case, since it's rare for you to come here, why don't I be the tour guide and show you around the blood-dripping church? This. Huai Shi was stunned. Is this appropriate? You are the bishop's guest, of course. Alexei smiled and opened the door for him. At the same time, Russell heard the sound of the door closing behind him. As the cold wind dissipated into the void, the old man, whose face was covered in snow and ice, was thrown into a chair. In the solemn and cold church, the door was tightly shut. Under the faint sunlight from the stained glass window, he saw the back of the figure standing on the altar. It was so familiar. After a moment of silence, he coughed awkwardly. Long time no see, Katia. Call me Catherine the Bishop. Russell. Are we so close? When the female monk turned her head, her expression showed a trace of indifference and alienation. She did not look old, about 30 years old. Her long hair was fiery red. She was in the prime of her life and made people instinctively feel close to her. But at this moment, it made people feel uneasy, because that pair of gray eyes were filled with coldness and scrutiny. It was like a strict mother holding a pointer and facing a child who had made a mistake. Russell subconsciously leaned back and forced a smile. Don't say that, Katia. I haven't seen you for so many years. How have you been? As long as you're not here, I'm very good. Catherine the Bishop said coldly. It seems that you've been doing well. How can I be doing well? I'm all alone in the ivory tower. My students are disobedient. My subordinates are inconsiderate, and they always misunderstand me. Russell sighed helplessly. I only feel happy when I'm drunk occasionally. Sometimes when I'm reading, I think of you. I've kept the books you left behind. Are you just starting to cater to my interests? Isn't it a little late? Catherine the Bishop sneered. Everyone knows that you're only interested in pornographic books. People change, Katia. Russell refuted. I can change too. Why don't you believe me? Without waiting for Catherine the Bishop to speak, the old man slowly stood up. His cloudy eyes stared at his long-lost girlfriend, and he sighed hoarsely. No misfortune can be compared to losing time, right? He said, Katia, we've missed too much. Come on, Russell. Catherine the Bishop replied indifferently. No matter how you feed the wolf, its heart will always be with the forest. Believing that a person like you has feelings is the biggest mistake I've ever made. I've also made a mistake, haven't I? It's the biggest regret of my life to sit back and watch you walk towards conversion. But everything is irreversible. Russell sighed. After a moment of silence, he suddenly recited softly. It said that Lavretsky once went to the remote monastery where Lisa lived in seclusion and saw her. When she was going from one choir seat to another, she walked past him with the regular, hurried, and respectful steps of a nun. She didn't even look at him. Her eyelashes trembled slightly when she looked at him. What did they think? What did they feel? Who knows? Who can say? Just like that, Russell slowly walked forward as he recalled the words in the famous poem. He gently held her hands and said in a low voice, Katia, there are such brief moments in life, such feelings. Bang! A low muffled sound burst out. Russell's emotional recitation came to an abrupt end. He widened his eyes and mouth in disbelief. Slowly, he knelt on the ground. Catherine the bishop pulled her hand out and tidied the creases on her nun's dress. The slender leg that had just delivered a vicious blow to Russell's crotch had once again disappeared into the darkness, as if it had never moved. This angle is much more pleasing to the eye. Why didn't I notice it before? Catherine the bishop lowered her head and looked down at the old man. She sneered. Let's end the boring reading session, Russell. She said, it's time to talk about the old grudges between us. Chapter 941. The short silence was broken by the sound of coughing. On the ground, dust flew up. TSK. Aya, you really haven't changed at all. Lying on the ground. Russell turned over with great difficulty and looked at Catherine's cold and indifferent appearance. You despise all weak emotions, including love and gentleness. Yet, you're known as Gaia, who is known for her love and compassion. Katia, when will you be able to face yourself honestly? Boom! On the floor, there was a big hole where Russell's head was originally. Russell had magically floated up from the floor and stood firmly again. Catherine, who was opposite him, seemed to be motionless. She just said indifferently, Of course, it's after I can face you calmly, Russell sighed. I understand your resentment and misunderstanding of me. But didn't we break up peacefully back then? Peacefully? Catherine was puzzled. Are you referring to the incident on the eve of the clerk's election where you framed me and caused me to lose my qualification? Russell's expression froze. After a long time, he said solemnly, That was an accident. An accident involving you? Catherine shook her head. Russell, you have never been involved in accidents. You are the accident itself. At first, I still believed in your innocence and promise. But how did you repay me? More lies, more deception. You noticed the fall of the kingdom of heaven in advance, but you didn't say anything. Instead, you deceived me to the present, because it was too late to save you. This is not a reason to stand by and do nothing. Catherine sneered. You are a disgrace to your teacher. Yes, he did say so, but I also have my difficulties. Russell sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was troubled. It seems that I really can't clear my name. Do you need to clear your name? Catherine took a step forward. The solemn and cold nun stretched her neck and whispered in his ear, Do you really think that I don't know what you are hiding, Duskmere? Russell was silent. After a long time, he raised his hands helplessly. I admit defeat. Can we not talk about this topic? Then let's talk about how you're going to compensate me for my losses. The female bishop sat on a chair that grew out of the ground. Her posture was prim and proper. How about a public apology? Admit to your original framing and conspiracy, then step down and give up the things you don't deserve. And then hand it over to you. Russell laughed and spread out his hands. Look, Katia, with such a strong desire for control and such strict moral standards, there is no room for an unstable factor or a stain. I can tell you with all due respect that even if you pass the selection, you will not be able to become a clerk. He shook his head and sighed helplessly. Why don't you want to admit it? You're someone who has been abandoned by fate, just like me. Then what are you doing now? Me? Russell thought about it and shrugged. I just accepted my fate. You should be like me. Look, Russell, back then, you treated everything as child's play. Now, you're starting to revere fate? It seems that aging really does increase virtue. But isn't your fate to go with the flow? Why are you appearing in front of me now? Maybe it's because a big wave is coming? Russell did not care about the other party's humiliation. He replied cheerfully, To tell you the truth, a duckweed like me has also joined the tide of fate. Do you want to know? Do you want to know why? But I won't tell you. Catherine the Great's expression became colder. You should understand that the celestial genealogy cannot be rebuilt. Then who told me this? Russell asked, Catherine the celestial genealogy? Or the old godmother of the Russian Federation? Both, Catherine the Great said coldly. Catherine said coldly, You have to answer carefully. This will not only determine the decision of the Russian Federation, but also the attitude of the Divine Essence faction. You can't fully represent the path of the Divine Essence, Katia. Russell smiled proudly. Isaac is still helping me. Catherine the Great shook her head. Forget it, Russell. Although I don't know what you said to tempt my unlucky student. Do you expect him to disobey me? As long as he's on my side, that's enough. Russell said, even without the support of the Russian Federation, I can rebuild the celestial genealogy. Katia, you're wrong about one thing. The celestial genealogy is never something that can be rebuilt with help. No one can help us rebuild the kingdom of heaven, only ourselves. Not Rome, not Dongsea. Even without America's support, I will still insist on doing it. You're used to power and think that power can do everything. Indeed, power can do everything, but power is beyond everything. Didn't you join the celestial genealogy because of this unreproducible value? Katia, why can't we work together? If we work together, the rebuilding of the celestial genealogy will be a foregone conclusion. That sounds great, Russell. No matter what happens, a man like you can say such irresponsible words to others. It's as if you're living in a dream forever. Catherine the Great sighed. You promise a lifetime of happiness, but you don't understand the weight of marriage and eternity to a woman. I used to love you deeply, Katia, more than I love myself. Russell said solemnly, you should understand. This is a church, Russell. 400 years ago, if you said such words to a chaste nun here, you would be burned at the stake. The old godmother shook her head coldly. I've already converted, Russell. Whether the celestial genealogy is rebuilt or not has nothing to do with me. This is not an excuse. You should understand. Russell did not say anything. He used to love the woman in front of him deeply, just as the woman in front of him used to love him deeply. Unfortunately, they were the same kind of people. They both loved something more than themselves. Whether it was Russell's innate freedom or Catherine the Great's desire for control, they were both high walls that could not be crossed. Love might be important, but it was definitely not the main theme of life. They went to the Utopia because they believed that human life had more value. That was why they met, and because of that, they would never compromise. It was because of this that conflicts broke out during the selection of the Clerk of Fate. The so-called accident was just a prelude. Both sides knew that unless the other side withdrew, they would fall in front of the Utopia gate. Even if it was the love of their lives, they would never give in. After the fall of the Utopia, Catherine the Great, who was tricked by Russell to come to the present, was disheartened. She chose to convert, became a chaste nun, and joined the Russian Federation. This was also why she hated Russell's inaction. Being trapped by the current situation was never an excuse for inaction. If he really wanted to do something, no matter what, the situation would have changed. He had violated his duty. A person's talent had to be put to good use. If this path did not work, then there was another path. Since then, she had not slacked off for a single day for 70 years. Until today, among the believers baptized by her, she had trained 191 Templar knights and thousands of priests and nuns. Every ascendant who had received her kindness willingly called her godmother. Even though she was a woman, her influence was not inferior to that of the patriarch. She was a saint who had directly received the blessing of the god of nothingness. Even the capital of the Ural region was named after her. The Church of Dripping Blood was the place where she used to execute traitors. Gaia of the Russian Federation. That was what everyone called her. She had already achieved something, and it was impossible for her to easily abandon everything, change her tune, and rejoin the broken celestial genealogy. You should understand that even if the celestial genealogy could be reorganized, it would be meaningless. You're already so old. What else can you do? Catherine asked. Rebuild the Utopia? Stop dreaming. I originally thought that you would tell me how much I can do and how little I can do, but I still have to do it. Russell shook his head. I have been dispirited for so many years and have nothing to do. But as a teacher, I have to set an example, right? Katia, even if I can't do it, there will be students who will take over the mission from me. That young man you are teaching, Catherine understood and sighed with pity. It's a pity that you found the wrong teacher. To be able to be called the Sword of Calamity, he might have greater achievements in the future, right? He is the successor that I have personally chosen. Katia, don't underestimate him. Russell smiled happily. He will far surpass me. As soon as he finished speaking, a low, muffled sound erupted from under their feet. It was far away. The two of them looked at each other in unison. Catherine's expression was subtle. Russell, on the other hand, was a little embarrassed. And under their feet, in a place even further away, there was a cry of surprise. They are fighting. Young people. Russell scratched his face and coughed twice. It's normal for them to be a little combative. Catherine looked at him deeply and said indifferently, I just hope that the Sword of Calamity won't chop off someone's head in front of me, his godmother. 10 minutes ago, in the bustling training ground under the dripping blood cathedral, Alexis stood in the distance with Huai Shi and softly introduced the new blood in the training ground to Huai Shi. Although they were called new blood and young people, in fact, they were about the same age as Huai Shi. Some of them were even much older than him, looking almost 30 years old. But no matter who it was who was blessed by the holy apostles, they would only be called new blood here, preparing to become a holy knight one day. And in the field, the ascendants who were training also noticed the people on the sidelines. A burly young man who had just walked down from the arena walked over, wiped the sweat on his face, and nodded respectfully to the priest. Mr. Alexis, you guys continue, don't worry about me. Alexis said warmly. I'm just here to bring a guest to take a look. The young man was stunned for a moment and looked doubtfully at the guest, who seemed to be younger than him. As if he had thought of something, he suddenly raised his eyebrows and could not hide his fighting spirit. He is Huai Shi, the Huai Shi from the astronomy club? Huai Shi's heart suddenly tightened. He was skeptical, but he suppressed his joy. Could this be the legendary opening gambit? Good Lord, it's finally my turn to play the pig to eat the tiger. That's right. He nodded reservedly, suppressed his excitement, and put on a calm and collected posture. The burly man was stunned for a moment, his sharp eyes scrutinizing Huai Shi for a moment. Then he suddenly took a step forward, bent 90 degrees, and pointed the back of his head at Huai Shi. Huai Shi subconsciously retreated, wary of the legendary Russian Federation's unique headbutt technique. Then, he heard the burly man and the other burly men behind him plead with respect. Please guide us. Huai Shi was stunned on the spot. Chapter 942. What the hell? He scratched his ears in disbelief. Why did he use the fiercest aura to say the most cowardly words? No. Is there something wrong with your plot? Huai Shi was embarrassed for a moment and asked doubtfully, Aren't you here to challenge? Upholding etiquette is part of the Holy Church's dogma. Alexei coughed and looked at the trainer seriously. Pay attention to your image, student Anton. Generally, when an expert comes, everyone will look at the person and act accordingly. Anton's gaze suddenly drifted. If it's an arrogant person, everyone will generally recommend a person who is more resistant to a beating to provoke him, and then kneel down and admit defeat before the other party gets serious. After satisfying the other party's desire to win, they can take the opportunity to ask for guidance. Everyone says that Mr. Huai Shi is easy to approach. As long as you ask him directly, he will definitely not refuse. The everyone you're talking about, is it Father Alexei who you always secretly glance at beside me? Huai Shi looked to the side. Alexei became more and more embarrassed. After coughing twice, he said embarrassedly, It's a rare opportunity. Young people always don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. It's rare for you to come and give them tutoring lessons. Okay. The corner of Huai Shi's eyes twitched twice, and he nodded helplessly. Who said that the people of the Russian Federation were stupid and crude? Why do they have so many tricks up their sleeves? Then, can you give them some guidance? Alexei's smile became more and more enthusiastic. How do I guide them? Huai Shi scratched his head. A public lesson on the traditional beheading method of the Slavic greatsword? It's okay, just give them some guidance. Alexei turned around and glared at Anton. Hurry up and get ready. Immediately, The group of strong men nodded excitedly and cleared the center of the arena in an instant. When they heard that the disaster sword was coming to give guidance, countless people ran out of the underground training ground like magic. In an instant, it was so crowded that not even a drop of water could trickle through. Some people excitedly took out their mobile phones and began to take pictures. Suddenly, they had the illusion of holding an album release. Fleischer scratched his head. After taking off his shoes, he walked up to the central ring. When it came to giving pointers, it was actually still a fight. However, one had to be able to help others grow and improve. Thus, one couldn't instantly defeat them. Instead, the most important thing was one's control. He had to control himself so that he wouldn't defeat his opponent in an instant. At the same time, he had to control his opponent so that he would realize his own shortcomings. Since that was the case, he couldn't use origin substances. Otherwise, he would be bullying a child. When Alexei handed over a Slavic broadsword and protective gear for teaching, Fleischer felt helpless. I'm not good at these things. They really don't belong in the category of teaching. The size of a weapon, the change in its center of gravity, and the shape of the weapon would affect its performance and use. For example, a rapier might be useful in a duel, but it could not be used against an opponent with armor. A spear might be useful in every battle, but it would be at a disadvantage against a sword and shield. Regions, schools, and even the user's height, weight, and strength. These different conditions caused countless differences. The size of a sword of virtue belonged to the category of a hand and a half sword. Fleischer had never studied this kind of heavy weapon before. If he really wanted to use it, he would use a sledgehammer. Knights of the Holy Church relied on this to make a living. They didn't need him to teach them. Fortunately, although the weapons and armor in the world varied greatly, after discarding the strange physical modifications, everyone basically only had 2 legs, 2 arms, and 2 fists. Although there were many schools of barehanded combat, they all followed the same principle. How about this? I'll demonstrate how to fight barehanded with a large sword and equipment. After Fleischer rejected the equipment that Alexei offered, he rolled up his sleeves and said, "Change them to iron. It'll be more suitable for real combat." Alexei was stunned for a moment, then nodded in agreement. Indeed, that's better. Right in front of him, Fleischer raised his 5 fingers and chopped down slightly. The low and deep sound of something breaking through the air suddenly burst forth in the noisy training ground. The whistling sound reverberated in everyone's ears, immediately causing those excited expressions to turn solemn. Feeling the power contained within the sound, they all gasped in amazement. Even if the Sword of Calamity was known for being proficient in hundreds of weapons in the legends and records, it was now able to exert such terrifying power with bare hands. In terms of lethality, it was not inferior to any famous sword that had been tempered thousands of times. Soon, the first lucky person had already walked up from below the stage. It was Anton, who had just walked up. He hugged his helmet, and his face was bruised and swollen. It was obvious that he had fought with his companions for this position. "Please give me some pointers." He put on the heavy helmet and raised his weapon, eager to try. He didn't notice the pitiful look of his instructor, Alexei, at the side of the field. "Silly child, you still don't know that you've become a teaching tool. All of you don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. Do you really think that you can compete with your opponent on the same stage? Dream on." Bang! The moment Anton roared and rushed up, a low muffled sound burst out before he could finish his sentence. His entire body seemed to have been flipped over by a huge force. Together with the armor on his body, he slammed hard on the plastic floor mat. Only the broadsword that had been released from his hand flew in the air. Fleischer casually caught it and held it upside down. The ball of weight at the end of the broadsword touched the back of Anton's head and retracted it. Bang! There was a soft sound. The winner was decided. Even if it was a child, with a broadsword as heavy as a sledgehammer, smashing it at the back of Anton's head would make him lie down on the spot. The threat of a blunt weapon against an armored opponent was obvious. "Did you see it clearly?" Fleischer lowered his head and asked. Anton looked confused, and the exclamations of the people around him were brewing in their throats. The scene was dead silent. Except for a few sharp-eyed people. No one saw the details just now. Then, let's do it again. This time I'll slow down. Huaisher stretched out her hand and casually pulled Anton up from the ground, sending him back to his original position. She then explained to the people around her, against an opponent wearing armor, normal attacks will not be able to do any damage. Furthermore, the steel structure of the armor also means that joint attacks will not be able to do anything. Similarly, with the protection of the steel neck guard and key parts, twisting skills are also useless. Of course, if you have enough strength to twist steel, then it's a different story. But in this case, there's no skill to speak of. So, who can tell me, what are the remaining options now? At that moment, someone in the crowd suddenly understood. Ground skills, you guessed it a little, Huaisher smiled, causing Anton, who was about to charge again, to suddenly feel a chill in his heart. But when he subconsciously wanted to defend himself, he saw Huaisher move slightly to the side and take a step forward, approaching him. He casually pressed down on his shoulder and pulled him back. At the same time, he inserted his right leg between his legs and easily broke his balance. In an instant, the sky and earth spun, and the muffled sound from before reappeared. The whole ground came crashing down again. Anton's vision turned black, and he almost couldn't get up. Strictly speaking, this should be a tripping technique, right? Huaisher reached out and pressed on his back, preventing him from getting up again. He slowly explained, the demonstration just now wasn't typical. You don't have to deliberately learn it. Just refer to this idea. This isn't a jack of all trades move. When the difference in strength between the two sides is too great, I'm afraid that the opponent will only break your leg. Only when the difference in strength between the two sides isn't too great, then there's a possibility of making up for your own weakness. He reached out and helped Anton up again. Let's continue. Anton stood in the same place, panting for a long time before he finally recovered. This time, he didn't dare to charge forward like last time. Instead, he was cautious and slow, closing the distance step by step. If that's the case, the enemy would have run away long ago. Huaisher shook his head and smiled, but Anton was unmoved. He approached step by step. Every step was steady, without any negligence or flaw. He was focused on maintaining a defensive posture. You can't not attack, right? Huaisher looked at him calmly and slowly raised his hand, aiming at his face behind the mask. Then, I'm going to attack. The moment Huaisher clenched his fist, a great chill emerged from Anton's heart, making him tremble. He instinctively slashed his sword at Huaisher, who was 2 steps away. Idiot! Alexei shook his head and sighed. At that moment, Anton expected to smash his iron helmet and smash his head into pieces, but the fist didn't hit him. Instead, he opened his 5 fingers, and as Huaisher stepped forward, he easily dodged the sharp edge of the sword. Then, he put one hand on the armor on his arm, and then the other hand pressed down on his shoulder. He pulled forward. Originally, he could have used a more violent and destructive shoulder throw to achieve the same effect, but considering the physical limitations of the others, Huaisher paused for a moment and changed to the current method. Thus, in this long silence, there was only a muffled sound that burst forth again. Did you see it clearly? Huaisher pressed down on Anton's back, hiding it from his students who were sitting on the ground. The key is to stay calm. Don't panic. Look for opportunities to break the opponent's balance, and fight for an opportunity to create an effective attack or escape, like this, or whatever. The armor's protection is also a restriction. When the opponent loses the ability to fight back, the battle is already over. Following his words, Huaisher raised his hand and pressed down, causing a 5-fingered imprint to appear on Anton's helmet. Then, his hand chopped down, easily tearing apart the joints on the heavy armor, causing the armors on both arms to fall off. His hands are like phantoms, making it hard to see clearly. They were so gentle that there wasn't even a sound. When Huaisher's palm swept down from top to bottom, the armor on the ground had already disintegrated inch by inch. The sound of steel breaking rang out continuously. In the end, only Anton was left gasping for breath. Huaisher, on the other hand, stood up calmly as if he had just bent down to peel a green onion. He patted Anton's shoulder and encouraged him to work hard, then raised his head and said, "Next." Chapter 943. When the second student stood in the arena, Huaisher almost couldn't help but laugh out loud. It seemed that he was intimidated by Huaisher's appearance of tearing apart the heavy armor with his bare hands just now, so he simply went all out. Even if Huaisher guaranteed that he would not use extraordinary abilities, the second student still did not dare to slack off. Since wearing armor was the same as not wearing it, then he might as well not wear it. After sacrificing meaningless defense, he gained mobility and adaptability. At this moment, Alcide was only wearing a tight-fitting swimsuit. Although it was light, it was covered with fine and complicated fish scale-like materials, so its defense was obviously not bad. He held two traditional Cossack chakshima swords in his hands. After saluting Huaisher, he circled around him and began to test him. "Don't worry, I won't attack first," Huaisher repeatedly assured him. "Are you sure you don't want to change your equipment? This set of equipment has no teaching significance at all." "It doesn't matter. I will do my best to pose a threat to you." Alcide grinned. As he wandered, the two sabers in his hands constantly rotated and changed. He held them forward and backward as if they had grown naturally in his hands. It could be seen that he was skilled and flawless. Everything within 5 steps was within his attack range. The Cossack sabers were originally known for their speed, and they were always successful in battles between cavalry. For the Templar Knights, it was completely easy for them to reach the speed of a warhorse. It was obvious that he was determined to find an opening to launch an attack and escape with one strike. He would not continue to fight. Huaisher sighed. A battle like barehanded against dual sabers has no teaching significance at all. He scratched his head helplessly. Why don't all of you look at the basics and focus on high-end operations instead? An opportunity. The moment Huaisher scratched his head, Alcide, who was spying from the side, had his eyes lit up. He instinctively grasped the opportunity, and the light of his saber pierced through the air and swept past Huaisher's chest. He got it. Then he saw the disappointment in Alexei's eyes. When you raise your hand, your elbow should be 2 centimeters higher. Don't be in a hurry. Behind him, Huaisher reminded him, there's a problem with the coordination of your steps. The linkage between your upper body and lower body is disjointed. Here. As he spoke, he stretched out his hand and tapped Arcady's back. It was an understatement. On the other hand, Alcide staggered and rushed forward 2 steps. He was unable to stand steadily because of that gentle press. That was the missing link in the transmission of power. Even he himself had never noticed it, yet it was so easily seen through by someone else. He retreated as if he had been electrocuted. He turned around and prepared for battle. "You should be more steady, Arcady," Huaisher suggested. "Before creating results, you should first learn to preserve yourself. It's not a good habit to gamble too much in a life-and-death battle." Although he said that, when it was his turn to gamble, he had done so many times. The problem was that if he failed, he could always take responsibility for it. However, for others, they might not have the ability to do so. After a short breather, Arcady took a deep breath and regrouped again. He charged at Huaisher without hiding anything. His speed increased sharply, and the 2 sabers in his hands slashed down in a crisscross manner. After being seen through, he chose to give it his all. If you always don't care about anything, it's easy to die early. Facing the saber light on his left and right, Huaisher sighed. He stretched out his hand and casually grabbed his wrist. With a sudden shake, the 5 fingers on Arcady's left hand involuntarily loosened. The saber fell into Huaisher's hand and blocked the slash on his right. Then, Huaisher took a step forward and bumped his shoulder into Arcady's chest, interrupting his breathing and causing him to cough and retreat. However, the saber in Huaisher's hand slashed at his face. A cry of surprise rang out. Arcady leaned back subconsciously, but then his feet were swept by Huaisher, and he fell to the ground in a sorry state. Then, a saber flew towards his face. It was nailed to the plastic spot next to his ear, and it buzzed. When facing an opponent who is far better than you, you must remain calm and never make mistakes easily. because once you make a mistake, you will be at the mercy of others. Huaisha lowered his head and said seriously, "You should try to hone your basic skills again. Being in a hurry for success will only leave you with an insurmountable flaw after a short-term improvement." Thank you for your guidance. Arcady swallowed hard and suppressed the urge to pant. He got up from the ground with a red face and left the ring. A bunch of idiots. Alexis shook his head and sighed softly. After hearing that Huaisha had arrived, they excitedly asked Alexis to bring the disaster sword to guide them. But in fact, how could Alexis not know about this group of impetuous people? It was true that they were asking for guidance, but more than that, they just wanted to understand the gap between themselves and an expert. It was not a pity if they lost, and no one would think that they could win. But if they could improve or break through, wouldn't it be better? It was just a show of mischief. In a word, it could be said that they were being disrespectful. That was the disaster sword that even the bishops of the region would treat with respect, the self-proclaimed king of Donbua, who split the earth in the realm. What was the point of a moment of guidance to a group of rookies who did not even have a solid foundation? True ability was something that could only be improved after painstakingly working day and night, continuously tempering 365 days a year, and even after countless thoughts and exercises with full concentration. Stigmata, origin, substances, abilities, skills, knowledge, etiquette, speech, and even faith, determination, perseverance, and persistence. Since one wanted to become a holy knight, there was no shortcut. Compared to strength, mental toughness was the most important. If it were not for the dripping blood church's face, he even wanted to privately ask Huaisha to make this group of people who did not know the immensity of heaven and earth suffer a few big losses. It would be best if he just broke a few legs. In the end, they still had too little training and too good nutrition, and they still had the mind to let their imagination run wild. Alexei stood expressionlessly with his hands behind his back, the palm behind his back, casually turning his lighter. He had already made up his mind. From tomorrow onwards, these 3 months, I will double the training for this group of people. No, super double. I have to teach this group of people what reverence is. And just as he was thinking, the third challenger had already stepped onto the stage. This time, Alexei nodded slightly. It was obvious that there were still people among the students who had a proper attitude and knew their limits. In comparison, he made the best choice. Under the condition of ensuring agility, he put on leather armor that protected his vitals and key parts, and he chose the lightest and most agile dagger as his weapon. In order to ensure lethality in the process of close combat, he made up for the gap between him and his opponent to the greatest extent. If Huaisha limited his strength to the level of an ordinary person, this would be the best way to ask for guidance and improve himself. That guy Yevgeny also recognized the gap between them. "Can we start, Mr. Huaisha?" The young man on the stage carefully bent down, raised his hands, and put on a dagger fighting posture. "Yes," Huaisha replied. "Anytime. I am very fast." Yevgeny reminded softly, "You have to be careful." Although he could feel the other party's seriousness, Huaisha still couldn't help but want to shake his head and resist the urge to laugh. "Okay," he nodded and said, "I will be careful." At that moment, Yevgeny disappeared on the spot. Huaisha's eyes widened. He only felt a bone-piercing chill appear behind him as the wind blew on his face. What a fast speed! It was already above the level of a third-order sublimator. He couldn't understand why, with such ability, he was still in the training camp of the Templar Knights. But before that, his body had already made a response. He took a step forward in an instant, turned around, and caught a glimpse of the outline that emerged from the gust of wind. It was reaching for the back of his heart with a dagger. This was completely beyond the scope of a Templar Knight. Instead, it was more like an assassin. How could he hide such an ability? Especially this unpretentious killing intent. Huaisha stretched out her hand in an attempt to grab his wrist and restrain him. However, in that instant, the dagger in Yevgeny's hand suddenly turned around and turned upside down. It changed direction and slashed towards Huaisha's wrist. Huaisha withdrew his hand, turned around, and smashed his elbow into Yevgeny's face. Yevgeny suddenly squatted and raised an arm to protect his side to prevent Huaishur from changing his move. Then, the dagger in his hand slashed towards Huaishur's throat again. But what was unbelievable was that Huaishur actually felt double pressure on his heart and throat at the same time. He was actually able to distinguish where the other party was attacking in a hurry. Throat, heart, or abdomen. When he withdrew his elbow and tried to block his chest, he found that he had judged wrongly because the dagger was aimed at his throat without any change in direction. Huaishur retreated. Yevgeny, who was squatting on the ground, suddenly jumped up as if he wanted to jump into his arms. The dagger in his hand slashed towards his calf. But just like before, Huaishur felt a faint tingling pain in his lower abdomen, genitals, and thigh arteries at the same time. Where exactly was he trying to attack? And where should he defend? No, defending anywhere would only be playing into his opponent's hands. This was supreme. At the moment of understanding, Huaishur raised his right hand and clenched his 5 fingers. The sound of his internal organs overlapped into a bundle and merged into his drumming hand. Under the support of supreme symphony, his hand chopped towards Yevgeny's arm. After a moment of delay, Yevgeny quickly retreated to defend. Then, he saw a black shadow rapidly enlarging in front of his eyes. Kick. Under the support of used steps, Huaishur's kick, which was enough to shatter concrete fortifications, was aimed at his face. But when he tried to defend, he found that Huaishur's kick had suddenly lifted upwards, and the other leg had already swept towards his defenseless lower body. In this arena, which was completely illogical, he took the initiative to lose his balance. With his elbow as support, Huaishur's blow hit the target, causing him to try to fall out of the air. Before he landed, his right ankle was already grabbed by Huaishur's hand and thrown towards the floor behind him. A loud sound burst out, and the ground suddenly shook. Even the plastic floor mat cracked. At this moment, Huaishur had already pressed down on his neck. His other hand was raised, clenched into a fist, aimed at his chest, and smashed down. The hurricane whistled, but it came to an abrupt stop. Huaishur's fist was suspended in midair, and he frowned. It's a girl. At this moment, the people outside the arena finally realized what had happened. Yevgeny. Alexei stepped forward angrily, but then he heard the door beside him open. A figure staggered in, holding the back of his bruised head. Damn it, my head hurts. What happened? The figure who walked and leaned against the wall and moaned hoarsely, Mr. Alexei, I was attacked. When the face was raised, it was Yevgeny in the arena. Everyone's expression froze. In the arena, Yevgeny slowly raised his hand, ignoring Huaishur's fist that was right in front of him. He grabbed at his own face and tore off the thin layer of skin covering his face. In an instant, it was as if he had changed into a different person, dispelling the illusion. His long golden hair spilled over his shoulders, and his flat chest slowly bulged. His height grew again, and when he raised his azure blue eyes, he was exceptionally happy. Nice to meet you, Mr. Huaishur. The girl grinned and said excitedly, I hope you like the surprise I prepared for you. Anya, Alexei roared angrily. You even dare to escape from the bishop's confinement? What are you doing? Of course I'm asking for advice, Mr. Alexei. The girl named Anna glanced at Huaishur happily. There has to be a back and forth to be considered teaching, right? Besides, you don't care about opponents like them at all, do you? As she spoke, she raised her head and moved closer to Huaishur's face, which was right in front of her. She sneered. Look at that gentle expression on her face, as if she's playing with a child in a kindergarten. What kind of disaster sword is that? Feeling the breath that was close at hand, Huaishur's face retreated, and he let go of his hand. You're right, he replied calmly. To be honest, I don't like this nickname very much. If tomorrow's news can be changed, I don't have any objections. Besides, killing people shouldn't be an ability to be proud of, right? TSK. Anna frowned, as if she was extremely disgusted by this calm grace, and did not hide her hostility. I'm sorry, Mr. Huaishur. Alexei quickly stepped forward. I will definitely give you an explanation for this matter. Absolutely not. His words came to an abrupt end, because Huaishur raised his hand. He stopped him from moving forward. No need, Mr. Alexei. The challenge is not over yet. It's just that there was a little accident. Huaisher shook his head, staring at the girl in front of him, and said in agreement, "You're right about one thing. As a teacher, since you have to teach, you should be more serious." "That's right." Anna raised her hand, wiped a trace of blood from the corner of her mouth, and widened her eyes in excitement. "You're finally serious? Come, let me see how powerful the talent that my godmother praised is." "It's not that powerful, but it's enough to teach children." Huaisher clenched his fist and slowly raised it. "But are you really ready?" At that moment, Anna's expression froze. She saw the smile at the corner of Huaisher's mouth. It was as if an overwhelming darkness rose from behind the man, swallowing everything, covering everything, filling her trembling eyes and shrouding her face in shadow. In the huge pressure that was like the deep sea, there was a chill that made her soul tremble. This was what the teachers specially prepared for disobedient bad children. Harsh education. Chapter 944. It was as if someone had opened a door that should not have been opened. It caused the darkness and nightmares behind the door to erupt. The moment Huaisher raised his eyes, countless tragic screams and roars seemed to explode in everyone's ears, violently tearing at their souls and consciousness, breaking down all defenses, and then cruelly pouring iron and ice into them. The burning pain appeared out of nowhere, followed by the terrifying, suffocating feeling of being frozen by the deep sea. The moment the gentle smile on that face disappeared, the whole world seemed to have fallen into the deepest nightmare. After abandoning the gentleness and thoughtfulness of accompanying children on a spring outing, what she got was the malice that only appeared when facing enemies. As Anna wished, Huaisher finally became serious. But what was the price? What was the price? At that moment, an invisible ghost whispered mockingly in her ears, "The price is falling into hell." Is this the sword of disaster? The girl could not help but bend her waist, like a lynx accumulating power. She just raised her hand, and the dagger on the ground jumped into her 5 fingers. On her raised face, her eyes surged with more and more fanatical joy. Facing such an enemy, her body moved, before she began to tremble. Then, she heard a soft chanting in her ears. "I know your actions. You are hard-working, persevering, and abhor evil." You once detected those fake apostles and exposed their masks. It was as if he was standing on an altar, overlooking the believers, and chanting the admonitions from the Holy Bible. You have to shepherd lambs. You have to let them know the good and evil, right and wrong of the world. But before that, the first thing that came was pain. Anna widened her eyes, only to feel her body suddenly become sluggish and numb, followed by a tearing and piercing pain that spread from her abdomen and engulfed her whole body. In an instant, it rushed over at a speed that was difficult for the enemy to see with the naked eye. Huaisher was already very close. He smashed a fist at the opponent's unguarded abdomen. As a result, his perfectly straight body bent under the impact of the iron fist, and he was sent flying backwards. Outside the field, Alexei widened his eyes in shock. He was not shocked by the strength that exceeded his expectations, but by such a familiar technique and attacking method. He stared at Huaisher's feet. The footprints that hadn't dissipated from the plastic floor mats followed Huaisher's straight forward and intertwined with Anna's footsteps. Flawlessly, it was connected to one spot. It was exactly the same. Was this a combat technique from the Supreme Court? An idea that even Alexei himself couldn't believe emerged in his mind. Following the loud bang, Anna's body flew over the crowd and crashed into the wall, leaving a deep dent. But then she crawled out of the crack in the wall and propped herself up. Like a wild beast, a ferocious and fanatical expression appeared in her bloodshot eyes. It flew towards Huaisher. What responded to her was a raised hand knife. Huaisher stood where he was and took a step forward. Just like that, he casually brushed past the slender young girl. "No!" Alexei lost his voice and reached out his hand subconsciously, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. The color of blood rose from everyone's eyes, blooming like a flower, spreading out along with the heads that flew into the air. It was a cruel and ferocious beheading, but it had such a soul-stirring beauty. It was flawless. It was as if every life was solemnly sent to the grave in the purest way. It was suffocating, but when their eyes followed the falling girl and landed on the ground, they saw Anna's body suddenly bouncing up from the ground, rolling and propping herself up. She raised her hand and touched the bruise on her neck. She didn't die. Inconceivably, the exquisite head was still in its original position. Even she herself couldn't believe it. Everything just now was just an illusion made by the mind and consciousness before the naked eye's observation. This time, Fleischer swung his hand and slowly turned his head. He looked at the girl on the ground indifferently and told her, "I know what you're doing. You're just living in name, but in fact you're dead." Every word, every sentence was so familiar. It was the canon and precepts from the religious court of inquiry. Even every step and every move just now came from the skills passed down in the court of inquiry. If he closed his eyes, Alexei would even think that the person standing in the arena at this moment was a dogmatic teacher of the court of inquiry, holding a red-hot iron rod in his hand and cruelly whipping an unripe disciple. That's great, that's great." Anna grinned and felt the fear in her heart at this moment, but she couldn't suppress her excitement. "You actually held back. You're too arrogant." "Why, sure." She licked the blood at the corner of her mouth and sneered. "Have you always been so gentle to little girls?" At that moment, her figure suddenly blurred. In front, behind, above, below, in the blind spots on the left and right, the outline of an assassin full of murderous intent appeared at the same time. Neck, back, genitals, arms, inner thighs, every vital part of his body felt a chill that was as sharp as a blade. Which one was fake? Which one was real? There was no need to care at all. Under the support of the supreme tier, Evil Moon, every single one of them could be real. At the same time, 6 reckless and suicidal assassins landed on Fleischer, leaving no room for him to dodge. However, it was also meaningless. Because it was too slow, Fleischer was unmoved and looked forward indifferently. So what if they were real? As long as he could defeat them before they could attack him, it would be fine. At that moment, the 6 phantoms disappeared without a trace at the same time. In the short gap before the attack was launched, Fleischer's fist had already pierced through the air. After crossing the distance of a few meters, it landed on her face without any hesitation. It was not the resonance of Supreme Tier, nor was it the shadow burial shuttle from Great Sea Ming. In the end, it was just a simple punch. Then, the sound of shattering echoed in everyone's ears. It was the crisp sound of ice breaking. After a layer of solid ice appeared, and his head was lifted up, almost crushed by the terrifying power contained in the punch. Her vision turned dark. But then, that pretty face came back again. Bright red blood was flowing out from her nostrils, but her smile was so excited as if she was embracing a dream. She launched an attack on Fleischer, who was just inches away. Along with the sound of the alarm, a cold chill suddenly appeared in the underground training ground, as if a Siberian snowstorm had descended, engulfing everything in the ring. All that could be seen was the silhouette of the two fighting, or rather, the tragic scene of a one-sided trampling. When Anna raised her head again, there was a merciless elbow strike, followed by a dull thud. But as if she could not feel the pain, her hand that was holding the dagger stabbed towards Fleischer's neck, which was then broken by a cold twist. Aiming at her heart, Kieran punched her. The rapidly growing solid ice, together with her bones and flesh, was shattered again. Only the unreserved power was poured onto her heart, causing the fragile organ to stop beating for a second. Anna staggered backward, but her raised arm was caught by Fleischer. He pulled her back, aimed at her face, and punched her again, breaking her left arm that was blocking her front. The sound of bones shattering was heard from the storm of ice and blood, together with the cold and deep chanting. It was like an admonition from the altar, engraving every word into her soul. You must repent, remember the lessons you heard and received in the past, and obey them. If you don't wake up, I will be like a nightmare, coming when you least expect it. Kieran chanted the words from the Holy Bible solemnly. Strict education was unreservedly bestowed upon the rebellious and bad student. It crudely corrected her deviant behavior, coldly reshaped her deformed soul, and cruelly taught her all the lessons. At the same time, it was compassionately bestowed upon her dogma and discipline. You must be vigilant and strengthen the remaining that is about to weaken. Because I see that none of your actions are complete in front of me, the storm roared. The bone-piercing coldness in the ice and snow erupted again, forming a blurry outline, pouncing towards Huaishur. But then, the sound of bones shattering disappeared. When the storm slowly dissipated, Anna, who was kneeling on the ground, slowly raised her head. She saw a pair of calm eyes, and in her heart, she suddenly came to a realization. The time for the end had arrived. Thou shalt repent. The cruel executioner held the axe tightly, aimed at her neck, and slowly raised it up. Finally, the shadow of death covered her face. She calmly closed her eyes. In the distant sound of bones shattering, she lost consciousness. She fell. Only the bloody flower in the illusion bloomed silently, blooming in the beauty and brilliance of death. But from the beginning to the end, Huaishur never drew his weapon. He only glanced at her, and this brutal execution came to an end with Anna's loss of consciousness. Everyone was silent, shocked by the pure power that was displayed in just a few seconds, and even forgot to breathe. They finally understood something. The power called the Sword of Calamity. How terrifying was it? Alexei took off his priest's coat and covered the unconscious Anna. Thank you for showing mercy. He sincerely thanked the young man who brushed past him. Huaishur shook his head indifferently. It's just a lesson that I haven't attended for a long time. What is there to be grateful for? I'm not interested in teaching accidents. But what happened to her soul? It's a long story. Alexis sighed softly. Huaishur did not pursue the matter, but suddenly asked, after squatting in the mountains for a few days, my stomach can't take it anymore. I plan to cook something later. Do you want to join me? Alexis was stunned for a moment, then slowly nodded. Meanwhile, at the edge of the underground training ground, in a corner, two unseen figures were quietly observing everything. The Maiden of Frost? Luo Su stared at the young girl who was sent out and recognized that it was a miracle. The cruel god from Slavic mythology, the divine evolution of the Father of Frost that Huaishur had witnessed, and, at the same time, the side of the god of blizzard. This was the path of sublimation that evolved from the black god and the white god. Celestial genealogy, the path of transformation. What a deep malevolence. He sighed in surprise and looked to the side. There is no other possibility for such a serious deviation in nature. Katia, you actually let her use that thing? Chapter 945. The reason why he called it that thing was because Russell himself was not clear about its condition and the measures for safekeeping. Thanks to Catherine's outstanding safekeeping and sealing, other than knowing that it was extremely dangerous, Russell was completely clueless about the rest of the information. Moreover, he didn't have the slightest interest in understanding or getting close to those things that were his natural enemy. Even if it had the most shameless army and the most versatile ability in celestial genealogy, the Twilight system still had a weakness: the Ascendant themselves. The miracle that originated from the Norse gods was too tyrannical and huge, causing the Ascendant themselves to be greatly affected. There would be deviations in their personality and consciousness. To put it simply, the higher one went, the more they would become like the Norse gods. For example, for an old bastard like Russell, he did not care if he was disliked or not. After all, no one could kill him. However, the path of transformation was different, especially that thing. It affected and interfered with the soul. Even Russell himself might not be able to withstand it. He wanted to stay as far away from that thing as possible. Why would he still ask about it? Don't think that everyone is like you, Russell. Catherine shook her head unhappily. Children always like to think that they are omnipotent. That's why they're always asking for trouble. It's just that sometimes some of the suffering is more painful than what they expect. Russell was stunned for a long time and was stunned. Don't tell me that she dared to raise her head during the advancement ceremony. Didn't you tell her the consequences? There's a red button in front of people. No matter how serious the consequences are, some naughty children can't help but be naughty. Catherine sighed softly. It's just a glance, a touch, and a little bit of raising her head. It doesn't matter. It's a reverence, curiosity, or the so-called rebellious period. Sometimes it would lead to irreversible consequences. Sometimes it would lead to irreversible consequences. The more talented a child is, the more they will think that they can pay for all the consequences. However, things are not always like this. This is the fault of my education. The end result is that the evil in her nature is magnified thousands of times. As the price, kindness becomes so thin. Even if we send her to the Inquisition and restrict her with the rules, we won't be able to suppress her self-destructive tendencies and lethality, will we? Russell shook his head. After a moment of silence, he suddenly asked, "What if I ask Huaishur to bring her part back?" Catherine was silent for a long time. She turned around and looked at Russell. Her expression was disappointed and angry. Don't tell me that you don't know the consequences. That's why I suggested it. Russell replied nonchalantly, "Let's give it a try. Everything in this world has to be tried. Otherwise, when she evolves into a Kush, everything will be irreversible." Asking a young man to make an irrevocable sacrifice in order to correct another person's mistake, only to end up with nothing in the end? Russell, is your brain still clear? Russell smiled. I have confidence in him. If you're not afraid of losing your disciple, you can give a try. Catherine asked coldly, but what's the price? Russell, let me tell you the price. Back then, the Republic left 16 armory in the Russian Federation. All the border relics and weapons, as well as the 2 miraculous engravings. They should have been under your care all these years, right? Those should have belonged to celestial genealogy. Russell said, they'll all belong to me. Impossible. Catherine retorted indifferently. You know very well that Anna isn't worth that much. No, in your heart, she's worth it. Russell shook his head in understanding. He gazed at his former love and said with a smile, There's no need to hide it, Katia. In your heart, every one of your godson and goddaughter is much more important than a dusty and broken warehouse. The reason why you're called Gaia of the Storm and the godmother of the Russian Federation is not just because of your cold and harsh nature. As long as that child can smile at you again, you'll feel that it's worth it no matter what you pay. In the long silence, Catherine closed her eyes. She sighed silently. Russell, yes, becoming your student is the greatest misfortune of his life. On the contrary, the old man put his hands in his pockets and raised his eyebrows happily. Although I'm not his greatest misfortune, he's definitely one of my greatest blessings. In the corner of the restaurant, as the stew pot bubbled with steam, Huaishur heard from Alexis the reason for Anna's soul's aberration. No, rather than aberration, it was more accurate to say that it was incomplete. It was as if he saw half a person walking on the street alive and kicking, but he had no idea where the other half went. He didn't understand how such a bizarre imagination could exist. The black god and the white god? He scratched his head. The Slavic gods are really cruel. The barren land and the long winter. The people and gods of this land never liked the weak and despised the weak. It's better to say that before the arrival of the Holy Spirit genealogy, this had always been a place of natural selection. It's the same for the gods. Alexis crossed his hands and calmly replied, although the celestial genealogy is different, the source of the path of transformation comes from here. It's also a part of the black god and the white god. Since they had embarked on this path, they would inevitably be influenced and interfered with by their superiors. Just like the tacit understanding and affinity between Huaishur and Balder. While they were attracted to each other, they would also unknowingly usher in changes. And the gods were not something as simple as the stigmata. They had an even greater existence and countless shadows. The miracles that humans could observe were only their reflections on the ground. Therefore, there were also many incarnations. Just like the Frost Father, there was a harsh and cold front, as well as the image of Grandfather Frost, who was like an old man, and even the legend of the original Snow Maiden, who served the Frost Maiden. Back then, when the guys from the Pioneer Society collected the source books from all over the world for crowdfunding, they naturally wouldn't miss the miracle that had been rooted in this land for many years. At that time, what the Slavic genealogy gave up was the miracle of the white god Beloberg and the black god Chernobyl. Black and white, day and night, good and evil. In the end, what was formed was the path of transformation of the celestial genealogy. If the core of the path of Heaven's Inquisition was to share, then its core was the essence of human nature. After the fall of heaven and the collapse of the utopia, the last remnants of the path of transformation finally returned to this land under the protection of Catherine. Originally, Anna was the child that the bishop thought was the most promising. She became an ascender at the age of 8 and completed the trial of the Templar Knight at the age of 12. Bishop Catherine wanted to send her to St. Petersburg to study, but she wasn't interested in the Holy Spirit genealogy. Alexis sighed. In the end, she chose to follow her mother's path, but she became what she is today. After the malignant expansion, she was completely different from before. If the bishop hadn't sent her to the Inquisition and restrained her by iron laws and dogma, she would have solidified long ago, right? Sometimes, even she can't control what she does or says. Please don't blame her. Who would take such a small matter to heart? Huaisher shook his head and opened the lid of the pot. He sniffed the smell of the stew in the thick soup and put in 2 handfuls of basil leaves, stirring it. It's ready to eat, Mr. Alexis. I still want to go out in the afternoon, so I'll have to trouble you to keep me company. Sensing Huaisher's undisguised honesty, Alexis couldn't help but shake his head and laugh self-deprecatingly. He swallowed the words that he had prepared after racking his brains. It seemed that he had wasted his efforts all this time. From the beginning to the end, he probably didn't take Anna's offense to heart. In the end, Huaisher wasn't able to go out in the afternoon. Russell, that old bastard who came out of nowhere, took his place. Huaisher, I have an honorable task for you, Russell said vehemently. In order to save the celestial genealogy, the organization has decided to let I can't afford to save it. Huaisher clasped his hands and turned to leave without looking back. However, just as he turned around and took a step, he found himself back at the same place. Russell was still smiling in front of him, full of the meaning of arrangement. You've been eyeing me, haven't you? Huaisher was angry. How can you suddenly disappear for half a day, come back without saying anything, and order me around like a tool? The greater the ability, the greater the responsibility. Russell wasn't ashamed at all. Isn't this something that only you can do? Good. Something that even Russell didn't dare to do. It was definitely a trap. Huaisher became more alert. What do you want me to do? It's nothing. It's really not dangerous for you at all. Trust me. Russell put his arm around Huaisher's shoulder and said enthusiastically, It's just going to look for a mirror. There won't be any problems. I understand. There will definitely be problems. And if the problem can't be solved, the consequences will be very tragic. Huaisher perfectly understood what Russell meant. Simply put, it's to treat the illness and save people. Russell announced his deal with Catherine without holding back. You'll sacrifice your body and spirit, sell your body, and I'll get the armory and border relics left behind by the Republic and the Russian Federation. How about that? Isn't it a sure win? Yes, you're a sure win, but what about me? Huaisher's eyes were about to roll to the sky. Then, let's get back to the topic. Russell snapped his fingers and suddenly asked, You should know about the 7.5 routes that Celestial Genealogy has announced, right? Huaisher was about to refuse, but when he heard his question, he was stunned for a moment and realized that he didn't seem to have paid attention to this problem. Although he knew about it, it wasn't too deep. He thought for a moment and counted with his fingers. Dusk, eternity, spirit marrow, maintenance, change, paradise, and my Heaven's Inquisition. But there were only 7 routes in total. A total of 7.5. What about the remaining half? Also, was there something not quite right about it? Why were there so many ambiguous records in the Book of Destiny? Just like that, While he was deep in thought, Huaishir was unknowingly led by Russell into the elevator. The metal door closed. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.